Welcome, welcome. You're here at Game of Theories. Today we present to you, what if Jon Snow was raised a Targaryen and returned to burn the usurper? Like and subscribe if you want more awesome stories. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Chapter 1. The boy who was never a bastard. The smoking sea smelled like sulfur and possibility, and Aegon Targaryen had loved it since he was old enough to stand on the cliffs above Oros and breathe it in without coughing. He stood there now, bare-chested in the morning heat, watching Vhagar spiral through the pale pink sky. The dragon was maybe 200 feet up, lazily riding a thermal with his wings spread wide, that distinctive black silhouette cutting across the dawn like a wound in the world. Every few seconds, Vhagar would tilt, bank, and the violet light caught the scales along his underbelly. Deep obsidian shot through with veins of dark purple, like bruises on stone. He was not the largest dragon anyone had ever seen. He was not Balerion or Vhagar of old. But he was young and fast and completely, utterly devoted to the young man watching him from the cliffs, and in Aegon's experience, devotion counted for more than size in almost every important contest. He raised one hand above his head without thinking about it. Vhagar folded his wings and dropped like a stone. 200 feet of open air disappeared in about 4 seconds. Then the wings snapped open again, cracking like thunder, and the downdraft hit Aegon hard enough to push him back a step, which he allowed because fighting the wind from a dragon's wings was the kind of thing that got people killed. And Vhagar landed on the clifftop with surprising delicacy, the massive talons finding purchase on the black rock, his great wedge-shaped head swinging around to push against Aegon's chest. The force of it would have knocked most men flat. Aegon just pressed back, both hands against the hard scales of Vhagar's jaw, and the dragon made a sound low in his chest. Not quite a growl, not quite a purr, something between the two that Aegon had never heard from anything else and suspected never would. "Sobs," he said quietly. "Fly." The word was Valyrian, old and round in his mouth, comfortable as breathing. "Nike Ivstragan Auhenujagan. I'll call you back later." Vhagar huffed a breath that smelled of ash and old fire, nudged him once more with the broad, flat nose, and then launched upward again, the wingbeats carrying him out over the smoking sea until he was just a dark comma against the brightening sky. Aegon watched him go, then turned back to the settlement below. Oros was not beautiful. It had never pretended to be. It was a collection of squat stone buildings on a volcanic island in the summer sea, populated by about 300 people who had, in one way or another, committed their lives to a cause that most of the world considered dead. Targaryen loyalists, survivors of Robert's rebellion and their children. Men and women who had fled the sack of King's Landing, who had escaped Dragonstone before the usurper's fleet arrived, who had carried their loyalty across the narrow sea and kept it alive through 17 years of cold exile and stubborn hope. Some of them were Westerosi born. Some were Essosi who had simply decided that the old dragon dynasty was the right horse to bet on, politically speaking. A few, like Serana, were something in between, born in lies to a Targaryen loyalist mother, raised in the borderland between worlds. All of them called him Prince Aegon except for Serana, who called him Your Grace when she was being formal, my prince when she was being ironic, and Jon when she was angry with him, which was often enough that he'd stop being surprised by it. He pulled his shirt on and started down the cliff path. The training yard was already busy by the time he reached it. Sir Miles Toyne, not the original Sir Miles, but his nephew, who had inherited both the Blackfish blade and his uncle's blunt manner, was running a group of 20 young fighters through sword forms in the morning heat, calling corrections in a voice that carried about as much warmth as the volcanic rock underfoot. 3 of those fighters were boys who'd been born on this island and had never seen Westeros. They were fighting for a kingdom they'd only heard described in stories, and they moved with the peculiar intensity of people who had something to prove to a world that didn't know they existed yet. Aegon watched them for a moment, then picked up a practice sword from the rack by the gate and walked into the yard. Sir Miles saw him and nodded once, not the nod you gave a prince, the brief tilt of the head that just barely avoided condescension, the nod you gave someone you trained yourself. "You're late," Miles said. "I was flying." Flying won't save you when V Heger's elsewhere and someone puts a blade to your throat. "True," Aegon said agreeably, and turned to the nearest fighter, a young man named Darius, quick on his feet and too reliant on his speed, and without preamble swung the practice blade in a low diagonal cut. Darius scrambled back, barely catching it, then immediately went on offense because he knew Aegon well enough to understand that defending was usually a losing proposition. They went at it for about 10 minutes. Darius was good. In a real fight against almost anyone else on this island, he'd probably win. He was fast, creative, and he had the particular fearlessness of someone who had never yet been seriously hurt. Aegon let him work, let him push, let him find what he thought was an opening in the high guard, and then stepped inside the attack so quickly that it probably looked like the space between two heartbeats, turned the blade aside with his forearm and put the flat of his practice sword against Darius's neck. The yard went quiet. "Your feet," Aegon said, not unkindly. "You shuffle left when you're about to commit. Every time." Darius was breathing hard, his eyes somewhere between embarrassed and awed. "I didn't know I did that. That's why it's dangerous." He stepped back, tossed the practice sword back toward the rack, and turned to find Sir Miles looking at him with the particular expression he wore when he was trying to decide whether to give a compliment or a critique and couldn't make up his mind. "Better," Miles said finally, which from him was practically a standing ovation. The council met at midday in the largest building in Oros, which was still not very large, a low-ceilinged hall with rough stone walls and narrow windows that let in the sea air but kept out most of the light. Around the long table sat the 7 people who had, in effect, been running this exile operation since before Aegon was old enough to understand what the word exile meant. Grand Maester Halling, old enough now that his hands shook when he lifted his wine cup, but whose mind remained an extraordinary instrument, sat at one end. Beside him, Lord Eddard Celtiger, whose family had survived the sack by the simple expedient of being at sea during it. Lady Morven, a Dornish woman of 60-something who had served as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Rhaella and who still dressed as though she was attending court at any given moment. Sir Miles, 3 others whose faces Aegon knew as well as his own reflection, and whose voices he could have identified in perfect darkness, and then Serana, who was technically the youngest person at the table by about 3 years, and yet somehow always managed to make everyone else look like they were catching up to a conversation she'd started without them. She was reading a scroll when Aegon came in, and she didn't look up. "You're going to want to hear this," she said. "Then you'd better tell me." She looked up then. Serana Velaries had her mother's lysine coloring, very pale, almost white blonde hair that she wore braided back from her face, and eyes that couldn't decide whether they were silver or gray, and had apparently given up trying. She was not the kind of beautiful that announced itself from across a room. She was the kind that crept up on you while you were paying attention to something she was saying, which Aegon had always found significantly more dangerous. "A raven arrived this morning from our contact in King's Landing," she said, setting the scroll flat on the table. "Jon Arryn is dead." Nobody spoke for a moment. Halling's shaking hands went very still around his cup. Lord Celtiger sat up straighter. Lady Morven closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again something had shifted in them, a cautious, fragile brightness. "How?" Aegon asked, sitting down. "Poison almost certainly, though the official word is a sudden illness." Serana's finger traced a line on the scroll without reading it again. She'd already memorized it. He'd been asking questions about the succession, about certain biological inconsistencies regarding the royal children. He was getting close to the truth about Cersei's bastards, Aegon said. He was. And now he's dead, and Robert Baratheon is sending a raven north to ask Ned Stark to come serve as the new hand of the king. She paused. Which means Stark will ride south, which means Winterfell is without its lord, which means the north is vulnerable, Aegon said, but there was no satisfaction in the word, more like something being named correctly and finally. Or receptive, Serana said, depending on how you approach it. Hallyne cleared his throat. The sound was very old and very deliberate, the throat clearing of a man who had been waiting to say something for 17 years. Your Grace, he said, and the formal address from Hallyne always landed with a particular weight because the old man used it rarely and meant it completely. If Lord Stark moves south, the political situation in Westeros will become genuinely fluid for the first time since the rebellion. Robert is ill. We've had reports of his health declining, the drinking, the weight, the hunts that are less about game and more about escaping the Red Keep. The Queen is consolidating her own position. The small council is a nest of competing interests, and Jon Arryn, the one man who might have been able to hold it all together, is dead, Aegon said. Is dead, Hallyne confirmed, which means the window, Your Grace, is open. The room breathed differently after that. Aegon could feel it, the particular tension of people who had been waiting for one specific sentence for most of their adult lives and had suddenly heard it spoken aloud. Some of them had tears in their eyes, barely restrained. Lord Celtiger's jaw was working. Lady Morven had her hands folded on the table with the preternatural stillness of someone who was white-knuckling their composure. He understood it. He did. He had grown up with their stories. The dragon skulls in the throne room, the gardens of the Red Keep, the glory of a dynasty that had held Westeros for 300 years. He had grown up being told he was the rightful heir to all of it, and he had never doubted it for a single day, which he suspected was one of the things that made him different from almost every other claimant in history. No imposter syndrome. No midnight uncertainty. He was Aegon Targaryen, son of Rhaegar and Lyanna, and the throne that Robert Baratheon had stolen was as much his by right as the sky was Vhaegar's. But he was also, still, the young man who had sat on that clifftop this morning with his dragon's nose pressed against his chest, and he had learned from Serana more than anyone that the difference between a king and a conqueror was whether you understood what your army felt. So he let them have the moment. Then, what's our strength? He asked Sir Miles. 300 on the island, 12 ships, 4 of them war galleys, the rest transport. Miles crossed his arms. We've got sellsword contacts in Essos. I can get another 500 blades within a fortnight if the gold holds. The gold holds, Lord Celtiger said. The Celtiger fortune survived the rebellion intact and has been accruing interest in Braavosi vaults for 17 years. We are not a wealthy family. We are an obscenely wealthy family. Ships, Serana said suddenly. The question isn't swords, it's ships. We need to hold a landing point. She was tracing something on the table now, a habit she had when she was thinking, her finger drawing invisible maps. Dragonstone. That's our first objective, not King's Landing. Take the ancestral Targaryen seat first, announce the return from a position of legitimacy, let the ravens fly. Then the great houses will have to respond one way or another. I was going to say the same thing, Aegon said. I know, I wanted to say it first. Sir Miles made a sound that might have been a laugh. It was hard to tell with Sir Miles. Lord Celtiger said, there is still the matter of the other claimant. The room went subtly quiet in a different way. Aegon tilted his head. Daenerys. Your aunt has her own dragons now, Celtiger said carefully. She is in Essos also. She has built something over the past few years, an army, a following. She calls herself the Mother of Dragons." He paused. "Her dragons are growing larger than Vhegar, your grace, or so we hear." "I know," Aegon said. "There is the question of whether I know about Daenerys," Aegon said more firmly. Not cold but final, the tone of a man who had already thought through a thing more thoroughly than the person raising it. "She is my blood. She is not my enemy. Whatever she has built, she built it for the same reason I built this." He gestured around the room. "Because a thief sits on our father's throne. We will not be fighting each other, I promise you that." "You haven't met her," Serana said, without inflection. "Number, but I know what she wants, and it's the same thing I want, and 2 dragons are better than 1. He looked at Serana directly. "When I was 7 years old, you told me that the only battles worth fighting are the ones where you know what you do with the victory before you start. Do you remember that?" Serana looked back at him with that expression she wore when she was simultaneously pleased that he'd remembered something she'd said, and annoyed that he'd deployed it against her. "I was 9. I may have been speaking above my station. You were right then and you're right now. We don't fight Daenerys, we find her." He turned back to the table. "But first we go home." Nobody argued. Not because they were afraid to, many of them had argued with Aegon plenty and survived it, but because there was nothing to argue against. The window was open. They all knew it. He had simply said the thing they'd all been waiting for someone to say. That evening, after the council broke and the others drifted away to plan and prepare, and in several cases, to probably cry privately, Aegon walked to the eastern edge of the island where the cliffs dropped straight down into the sea. Serana found him there about 10 minutes later, because Serana always found him wherever he went, a fact he had stopped questioning approximately 3 years ago. She sat beside him on the rock, not touching, her legs hanging over the edge the way they had since they were children sitting on these same cliffs learning the shape of the stars. Below them, the smoking sea caught the last red light of the setting sun and turned it into something that looked uncomfortably like burning water. "You're not nervous," she said. It wasn't quite an accusation, but it was adjacent to one. "Should I be? A reasonable person might be. You're about to invade a continent." "I'm about to reclaim a continent," he said. "There's a difference." She was quiet for a moment. A gull cried somewhere below them, and the sea made its slow, eternal sound against the rock. "The others are frightened," she said finally. "Celtigar is excited enough that he's not showing it, but Hallyne is frightened. Lady Morven has been frightened for 17 years. She's just been doing it politely." "I know. And you're not." He considered the question honestly, because Serana always deserved honest consideration, and she'd know the difference if he gave her anything less. He reached inside himself for the thing that should have been fear, the reasonable, sane, animal response to what he was about to do, and found instead something that felt more like a compass needle swinging to true north. Not calm exactly, not excitement either, more like correctness. The feeling of a thing clicking into place after a long time being bent. "When I was 12, he said, "Hallyne showed me the letters, all of them. My mother's, Rhaegar's correspondence, the records from the Tower of Joy. Everything." "Do you remember that?" "I remember you didn't speak for 3 days afterward. I wasn't mute, I was reading." He smiled at the sea. "I read everything Hallyne had. Everything about my father, my grandfather, the dynasty, the rebellion. I read Robert's own account of the trident which Celtigar somehow acquired from a Braavosi source, and I read my mother's letters to my father, and then I read about what happened at King's Landing afterward. What the Lannisters did to my family." His voice didn't crack, didn't roughen. It was just a voice. But Serana heard what was underneath it anyway, because she always did. "And I decided then that I wasn't going to be afraid of Robert Baratheon. Not ever. Not for one day. Because fear is something you feel toward a threat, and I understood at 12 that I was the threat. He should be afraid of me." Serana looked at him for a long moment. You were an extremely unsettling 12-year-old. You told me that at the time. I was right then and I'm right now, she said, echoing him deliberately, and he laughed, actually laughed, the real laugh that only came out with her, loose and unguarded, and she smiled, which she did rarely enough that it still caught him slightly off guard every time. They sat there for a while as the sun finished going down. I want you with me, he said, eventually. Not as a steward or an advisor, I mean on the ships, in the councils, at my side. I'm always at your side, she said. It's practically a curse. Serana, Jon, he let the name settle. She was the only person alive who called him that. His mother's whispered gift. The name Hallyne had told him Lyanna had breathed out with her last breath along with the truth of his parentage. Aegon was the prince, the heir, the name on the raven messages and the loyalists' prayers. Jon was the person underneath. And Serana was the only one who'd ever treated those two things as separate and equally important. I'll be there, she said, quietly. I was always going to be there. Don't make it strange by asking formally. He nodded. She stood, brushed the rock dust from her leggings, and walked back toward the settlement. He watched her go, then turned back to the sea. Above him, out there in the dark over the smoking sea, Vhegar called. A long, wild sound that was nothing like a bird and nothing like anything else alive. A sound that the old Valyrians had believed was the voice of the gods speaking through their children. Aegon listened to it. Then he called back. The next 2 weeks were organized chaos dressed up in the clothing of military precision. Sir Miles was everywhere at once, drilling fighters, organizing equipment, looking perpetually dissatisfied with everything in the way of a man who understood that perfection was the only acceptable outcome and reality's failure to provide it was a personal affront. Lord Celtigar's gold moved through Braavosi channels and came back as hired swords. A good company of 500. The Second Sons minus their most recent commander who had apparently had a disagreement with his employers about the definition of surrender. They were rough men but capable ones. And their new captain, a Cohoric named Durin with arms like ship masts, and a sense of humor that had apparently never fully developed, took one look at Vhegar and declared himself personally committed to the cause of Targaryen restoration. Hallyne worked day and night preparing the raven messages that would go out after the landing, or possibly during, depending on how quickly things moved. The old Maester wrote in a cramped, urgent hand that looked nothing like his normal script, as though his body understood that time had changed its character. Serana ran logistics. This was the part of the enterprise that Aegon had learned over the years to simply stay out of. When Serana was running logistics, which meant everything from food supply to the precise arrangement of ships in a harbor approach to the psychological sequencing of political announcements, she moved through the world with a ferocity that made Sir Miles's drilling look mild. She didn't sleep much. She didn't eat much. She argued with captains, charmed suppliers, intimidated harbor masters, and produced at the end of it all a plan that was tighter than a ship's rigging and half as visible from the outside. On the 13th day, she dropped a rolled parchment on Aegon's table. He was practicing Valyrian verb forms, which was either studying or procrastinating depending on how you looked at it without ceremony. Departure in 3 days, she said. 12 ships, 1,400 fighting men. Dragonstone will have a garrison of maybe 200. The Castellan is a man named Harlan Granby. He's been there 15 years. He has 4 children in King's Landing and one weakness, which is that he genuinely believes in the monarchy. Not in Robert specifically, in the institution. Meaning he'll respond to a legitimate claim. Meaning if you land on that island as who you actually are, show him the proof, and give him the choice between supporting the rightful king and dying for a usurper, he'll probably make the correct choice. She paused. Probably. I'd keep Vhegar on low approach just in case. Always, he said, She turned to leave. He said, "Serana." She stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for this, for all of it." She stood very still for a moment, her back to him, and he could see the slight tension in her shoulders that meant she was deciding whether to deflect the moment or receive it. Serana Velaries had a complicated relationship with gratitude. She found it easier to give than to accept, and she found the weight of what this enterprise meant to her significantly harder to carry in the open than behind the armor of competence and sarcasm. "My mother died on a ship crossing from Lies," she said, without turning around. "She was trying to reach Dragonstone when she heard Rhaella had given birth there. She was going to offer her service. The storm caught her before she made it." A pause. "She spent her whole life waiting to be useful and never quite got the chance." "You've more than made up for it," Aegon said gently. Serana turned around then, and there was something in her face that she didn't usually let him see. Not tears, nothing so demonstrative, just a raw and unguarded honesty, there and then controlled like a flame in a closing hand. "Don't thank me until we've won," she said, and then she left. On the morning of departure, Aegon stood on the dock and watched his fleet take shape in the early light. 1,400 men, 12 ships, one dragon overhead, doing lazy circles in a sky the color of old bronze. Hallyne came to stand beside him, moving slowly with his walking stick, his white robes immaculate despite the dock chaos around him. The old man looked at the ships for a long time and said nothing, and Aegon let him look. Finally, "Your father would be proud," Hallyne said. "I never knew my father, but I did." The old man glanced at him sidelong, and for just a moment, in the way his eyes moved, Aegon could see the ghost of the man Hallyne had been before all of this, before the rebellion, before the flight across the sea, before 17 years of waiting. A younger man, serving in a court that burned. He was brilliant and flawed, and he loved your mother in a way that was perhaps too large for the world as it was. You have his eyes, you have his certainty. A pause. "You have her stubbornness, which I mean as a compliment." "Tell me something about her," Aegon said. "You've met everyone who ever knew her. Tell me something true." Hallyne was quiet for a moment. Then, she laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them, every time. She could never get to the end of a funny story because she found them too funny herself. The old man smiled at the water. "Your Uncle Ned, apparently, found it enormously endearing. Her other brothers found it maddening. She did it anyway." Aegon held that image, a stark girl laughing at herself, unstoppable, and added it to the small collection of true things he carried about his mother. Then he nodded once, turned to face the fleet, and raised his voice so the men on the nearest ship could hear him. "We're going home," he said, not a speech, just a fact. On the deck above him, about 30 men raised a shout. It spread, ship to ship, down the line until the whole dock was roaring. Above it all, Vhagar screamed across the sky, a long violet flame jetting from his jaws for just a moment, a signal, or a salute, or simply the expression of a creature who felt what his rider felt and had no subtler way to say it. Aegon turned his face toward the west. The narrow sea was 12 days away. Westeros was waiting, and Robert Baratheon, drunk somewhere in the Red Keep, probably, pushing his food around a plate and telling old war stories to men who'd heard them 100 times, had absolutely no idea what was coming. Good, Aegon thought. Let him sleep a little longer. The first ship's gangplank lifted. The oars went out. The dawn wind filled the sails. He was 18 years old, and he had never been afraid, and he was going home to take back everything that had been stolen before he was old enough to know what stealing meant. He stepped aboard. Chapter 2. The Dragon Comes Home. The narrow sea was not kind to them. 4 days out from Oros, a squall rolled in from the northeast with the particular vindictiveness of autumn storms in that stretch of water, the kind that didn't announce themselves properly, just darkened the sky over the course of an hour and then hit like a fist. Two of the transport ships took on water. One of the second sons, a Myrish man named Pero, who had apparently survived 6 campaigns across 3 continents, spent the entire night being violently ill over the port railing and declared between retches that he was reconsidering his career choices. Aegon spent most of those 4 days on deck, not because he was particularly useful there. Serana would have been the first to point out that a prince standing in the rain contributed nothing to seamanship, but because the alternative was below decks in a low-ceilinged cabin with nothing to do except think, and thinking too much before a battle was the kind of thing Sir Miles had beaten out of him at 14. "You can plan," Miles had said during a particularly grim training session, "or you can worry. Pick one. Worry makes you slower." So he stood on deck and watched the sea and planned. The fleet had spread out in the storm, the captains too busy keeping their ships alive to worry about formation. But on the 5th morning the sky cracked open and turned blue again with that sudden, almost apologetic brightness that only comes after bad weather. By midday they'd counted all 12 ships. No losses. Serana appeared at his shoulder, looking like she'd slept approximately 4 hours total across 4 days and was running on something more fundamental than rest. She had a cup of something steaming and a rolled map under her arm. "Current position puts us 6 days out," she said, spreading the map on the deck rail and holding it flat against the wind with her forearm. "If the wind holds southeast, maybe 5. Aegon leaned over the map. Westeros spread across the parchment like a sleeping giant, and there, off the eastern coast, the stubby peninsula and its island, Dragonstone, his birthplace. The Targaryen seat for 3 centuries before the conquest and the last stronghold held by his family before Robert's fleet had— "Stop," Serana said without looking up. "I wasn't doing anything." "You were doing the thing where you look at the map and go somewhere else in your head." She did look up then, briefly. "We need you here." He straightened. "I'm here." "Good." She tapped the map. "Dragonstone's garrison. Granby commands 200 roughly. They'll have at least 2 scorpions on the walls, bolt throwers, the big kind, designed specifically for dragons," Aegon said. "For dragons," she confirmed without apology. "Vheager can take a bolt and survive it, probably. But I'd rather not test that hypothesis on our first morning in Westeros, so we go in before dawn. Vheager makes one low pass, visible, obvious, unmistakable, and then you go to the gate with a delegation under a peace banner and you give Granby his choice. And if he chooses wrong," she rolled the map back up, "then we find out how Vheager feels about scorpions." They made the approach on a morning so dark the sea and the sky were the same color, indistinguishable, as if the world hadn't fully committed to existing yet. No moon. The stars were out but cold and distant. Aegon stood at the prow of the lead ship and watched the shape of Dragonstone resolve from the darkness, the ancient fortress, its towers carved into the forms of dragons by builders who had understood that architecture could be theology, the high walls of black Valyrian stone rising from the island's peak as if they'd grown there. He had been born inside those walls. He didn't remember it, obviously. He had been hours old when the loyalist Maester Hallyne had bundled him aboard a ship and sailed east with a newborn prince and a secret that had now survived nearly 19 years. But Hallyne had described it to him enough times that he felt like he remembered the chamber of the painted table, the stone drum tower, the way the wind came off the sea and made the whole fortress sound like it was breathing. He breathed with it now, standing in the dark, and felt Vheager somewhere high above him, invisible in the starless sky. Issa, he thought, not quite a word, more like a shape in his mind, the mental equivalent of reaching out a hand. Hold. The sensation that came back was not quite thought. It was temperature and motion, and a kind of patient, coiled attention, Vheager circling above the clouds, watching, waiting. The bond between a dragon and its rider was not something Aegon had ever tried to explain to anyone who hadn't experienced it. Hallyne called it a form of heightened empathy, neurological and ancient. Serana called it strange and left it at that. The second sons, when they'd first watched him communicate with Vhagar without speaking, had gone very quiet in the way of men reassessing their fundamental assumptions about the world. He didn't think about it much. It simply was, the way his heartbeat simply was. Vhagar was his and he was Vhagar's, and that had been true since the dragon had cracked out of the egg that Hallyne had kept alive through 17 years of careful husbandry and absolute faith. The island was a mile off now. He could hear the water against the hull. No lights on the walls yet the garrison was sleeping. Sir Miles materialized at his shoulder, wearing the subdued expression he reserved for imminent violence. "Ready," he said. "Not yet." Aegon raised his hand. Now he thought, and shaped the image clearly, low, slow, the full span of wings, fire only if he sent the signal. Restraint and visibility at once. Vhagar came out of the dark sky like a myth deciding to be real. He came in low, perhaps 50 feet above the water, his wingspan throwing a shadow that eclipsed the ship entirely. The sound reached Dragonstone before the shape did, that rhythmic thunder of massive wings, a sound with no natural equivalent, a sound that every human brain registered as ancient danger at some level below conscious thought. He swept over the fortress from south to north, slow enough to be seen, the violet fire at his jaws just barely held back so that every scale gleamed with internal light. The effect on the garrison was immediate and loud. They could hear the shouting from the ship, horns blowing, the particular high-pitched urgency of men who had thought their morning was going to be uneventful and were now being informed by a dragon that they had been wrong. Torchlight appeared on the walls, figures running, pointing. Vhagar banked hard, came around again, and this time he was low enough that Aegon, watching from the ship, could see the faces of the men on the battlements, pale discs in the torchlight, all of them turned skyward. "Now," Aegon said. The ships pulled toward the dock. The gates did not open when they tied up at the harbor. The walls bristled with crossbows, and the two scorpions Serana had predicted, both cranked and aimed. A voice came over the wall, reedy with effort and nerves, trying very hard to sound authoritative. "Identify yourselves. Who comes to Dragonstone?" Aegon walked to the front of the dock. He wore no crown because he didn't have one yet. That was fine. Crowns were the end of a process, not the beginning. He wore black and deep red, the Targaryen colors, and he stood with the relaxed, unhurried posture of a man who has never in his life been required to justify his presence anywhere. "Aegon Targaryen," he said, loud and clear, no particular effort in his voice. It carried anyway. "Sixth of his name, son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, born in this castle." He paused. "You should open your gates." Silence from the wall, a long, complicated silence. Then the reedy voice again, cracked with something that was trying to be defiance. "Prince Rhaegar is dead. His children are standing in front of you," Aegon said, "along with a dragon, and documentation if you'd like to see it, though I suspect you've heard about the dragon already." He tilted his head. "Is Castellan Granby on the wall?" Another silence. Then a different figure appeared, larger, older, leaning on the crenellations. This voice was slower and had more gravel in it. "I am Granby." "Then you're the man I want to talk to. Come down. I'll wait." "You're making demands of a royal fortress." "It's my royal fortress," Aegon said pleasantly. "I'm asking to come inside." Beside him, just slightly behind his right shoulder, Serana made a sound that was almost certainly a suppressed laugh. Granby was quiet for a long time. Above the castle, Vhagar did another slow circle, and the torchlight on the walls was enough that everyone below could see the garrison soldiers tracking the dragon's movement with the scorpions, and could also see, if they were paying attention, that the Scorpion's operators looked significantly less committed to their task than they had a few minutes ago. "I'll come down," Granby said. "Alone. You stay on the dock." Agreed. He came down alone, as promised, and he was a broad man of about 50 with a soldier's bearing and a face that had been doing serious thinking since the dragon had woken him up. He walked to the gate, opened a smaller door set within the main gate, and stood in the gap, looking at Aegon without flinching. Aegon gave him credit for that. "Proof," Granby said. "You said you had proof." Hallyne stepped forward with the documents, the records from the Tower of Joy, the letters in Rhaegar's own hand, a copy of the secret marriage contract between Rhaegar and Lyanna that had been witnessed by 3 Septons and preserved by Hallyne with the obsessive care of a man who had always known it would matter. Granby took the parchments, read them in the torchlight, his face going through several evolutions while he did. He handed them back. He looked at Aegon for a long time. "You have his eyes," Granby said finally, not easily, with the weight of a man surrendering something. "So I've been told." Granby turned back to the door. "I'll open the gates, my men will stand down, but I want your word, the word of a Targaryen spoken at this gate, that no one in this garrison is harmed. You have it, and that I can send a raven to my family in King's Landing, to warn them." Aegon considered this for 1 second, not because he was uncertain, but because he wanted Granby to see that he'd actually considered it. "You have that too," he said. "Send it tonight." Granby nodded once sharply, the nod of a man who had made his choice and was already living with it. He turned back into the doorway and called up to the walls in a voice that carried the specific authority of a man who has been obeyed for a very long time. "Stand down. Open the gates." The gates of Dragonstone swung open. Aegon walked in. He walked through the fortress like someone returning from a long trip rather than someone seeing the place for the first time. Partly because Hallyne had described it so exhaustively that nothing surprised him architecturally. Partly because he had decided on the ship that the moment he set foot inside these walls, his body language would communicate what his words couldn't yet fully establish. That this was his home, that he had always been coming here, that nothing about this was exceptional. He went to the chamber of the painted table first, while Serana organized billeting for the men and Miles spoke to the garrison soldiers, not as a conqueror addressing the conquered, but as a soldier talking to other soldiers, which was the right approach and had been Aegon's suggestion. He left Celtigar to handle Granby and walked the dim corridor to the chamber alone. The painted table was exactly as described. Enormous, shaped like Westeros itself, every region picked out in hand-painted detail across the surface of the great stone table that Aegon the Conqueror himself had stood over while planning the campaign that had built the dynasty Jon was now reclaiming. The torches were lit. Granby had apparently sent someone ahead to light them, which was a small kindness Aegon noted. He put his hands on the table and looked at it. The 7 kingdoms spread under his palms. He found the north, enormous, gray-blue, the wall a thick painted line across the top. He found Winterfell, a small detailed fortress in the middle of all that gray. He found, without looking hard, a coastline and a bay and a castle called Storm's End, and he thought about Robert Baratheon's name being written in the registry of that castle's heirs, a line that should never have existed. He was still there when Serana came in. She looked at the table, then at him. "How does it feel?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "Like a map," he said. "Just a map. The real thing is bigger." She came around to stand beside him, and they both looked at the painted Westeros in the torchlight. "The garrison has accepted terms," she said. "No incidents. Granby's men are shaken but professional about it. 3 of them asked to pledge service, which I thought was fast." Granby said he believed in the monarchy as an institution. His men probably feel the same. Give them a legitimate king and the choice becomes easier. He straightened up from the table. "What about the Scorpions? Disarmed and secured. I'm not destroying them, though. We might want them later. Good thinking. She looked sidelong at him. Of course it is. He smiled. Then, because it was there and he had to, I want a raven sent to Essos by morning, to Daenerys' last known location. Serana had clearly been expecting this. She didn't argue, just nodded. I prepared a draft message on the ship. It's diplomatic. Good. It implies you consider her an equal, which you do, and an ally, which she may not yet be, but it's the right opening, he said. Send it. She picked up the scroll she'd been carrying since the ship. She must have brought it in with her, planned, and set it on the painted table. For a moment, the sheet of parchment with its careful, precise handwriting lay across the painted ocean between Essos and Westeros, connecting the two in a small, physical way. Send it, he said again. She picked it back up and went. He slept that night in the stone drum tower, in a room that Halline said had been used by Targaryen princes during the time before the conquest. The bed was not comfortable. The stone let in the sea wind. He slept like a man with a clean conscience, deeply and completely, and when he woke at dawn to the sound of Vehiger landing on the ramparts outside, heavy and deliberate, the dragon's equivalent of knocking, he lay there for a moment with his eyes on the stone ceiling and thought about the fact that he had done it. He was on Dragonstone. He was home. Then he got up because there was work to do. The first battle came on the third day, and it announced itself with dust on the horizon. Serana saw it first from the western watchtower. A column of movement, she said, coming along the coastal road from the mainland. Granby, who had settled into a strange position of cooperative captive over the past 3 days, identified it from its flags as a Baratheon force. Must have sent a rider the same night we opened the gates, he said, not particularly apologetically. The Stormlands garrison. How many? Aegon asked. Granby squinted at the distant column. That's more than I expected. Maybe 800. Someone moved quickly. They sent a fast rider to Storm's End, Serana said flatly, standing at the window with her arms crossed. She glanced at Aegon with an expression that said, I had a contingency for this. The lord of the nearest Stormlands holdfast would have sent to his liege, who sent men immediately. Standard response to an incursion. It's not an incursion, Aegon said. It's a homecoming. The Stormlands lord won't share your interpretation. He looked at the dust. 800 men. His 1,400 were good, but they were split. Most of the second sons were billeted in the lower fortress. The garrison was technically unaligned, and the approach to Dragonstone's causeway was narrow, which meant numbers mattered less than they normally would, but still. He didn't feel any particular tension about it. That was the truth. He felt the steady focus that came when variables simplified into a solvable problem. Get Miles, he said. Tell him 400 men at the causeway. Defensive formation, nothing aggressive. I want them to see we're holding ground, not advancing. He turned from the window. And send word up to Vehiger. Serana was already moving. What word? Just wake him up. The Stormlands force arrived at the causeway mouth in the late afternoon, the coastal light making their armor shine. They stopped when they saw the Targaryen banners on Dragonstone's walls, the 3-headed dragon in red on black, flying from every tower, put up on Aegon's second morning because symbolism was not nothing. It was in fact approximately 40% of this kind of enterprise. Their commander rode to the front. A big man, mid-40s, a Stormlands Lord Aegon didn't know personally but had read about, Lord Harlan Cafferin, a Robert loyalist since the rebellion, a man who had fought at the Trident and carried that fact like a medal. He rode to shouting distance and shouted, Who commands here? In the name of King Robert Baratheon, first of his name, I demand. I command here, Aegon said. He was riding out from the fortress end of the causeway, alone, which he had insisted on over Sir Miles's vigorous objection. Alone, on a gray horse, with Vehiger's shadow tracking him from above. He pulled up about halfway across the causeway and looked at Catherine from a distance that was intimate enough to be respectful. "I'm Aegon Targaryen," he said, his voice carrying on the sea wind. "This is my castle. You're welcome to come see it, Lord Catherine, but I'd ask your men to leave their weapons at the end of the causeway." Catherine was staring at him. Then his eyes went up to the sky, where Vhagar was doing his slow circle about 300 feet up, vast and unmistakable. "Robert Baratheon is king," Catherine said. The certainty in it was genuine, not a man defending a lie, but a man defending what he believed. Aegon had read about Catherine. He was honest. He was loyal. He had simply been loyal to the wrong man, which was a tragedy rather than a crime. "Robert Baratheon won a war," Aegon said. "Winning a war and being a rightful king aren't the same thing, and I think part of you knows that, or you wouldn't be standing out here instead of sending archers from cover." He let that sit for a moment. "I don't want to fight you, Lord Catherine. I have no quarrel with Stormland's soldiers. My quarrel is with the man who sits on my father's throne and with the people who put him there." He paused. "Go home. Tell Robert I'm here. Tell him I'm coming. And tell him to start thinking about what kind of legacy he wants to leave." Catherine's jaw worked. The men behind him had gone very still in the way of soldiers who are waiting for a decision and are quietly relieved they're not the one who has to make it. Every eye in that force was sliding upward to Vhagar with increasing regularity, and the horses were starting to express their anxiety through their feet. "I can't simply leave," Catherine said, and the admission in that can't, not won't, told Aegon everything about the man. He was bound by honor and duty to a king he hadn't chosen and couldn't abandon. "Then make a show of it," Aegon said, and his voice dropped slightly, less public, more direct. Just one man talking to another. "Give the order to withdraw in good order. Tell your men you've assessed the position and determined that a direct assault against a fortified Targaryen position with dragon support would be tactically unsound, because that's true. No shame in it. Ride back, send your raven, and let the politics sort itself out." He looked Catherine steadily in the eye. "I'm not your enemy, my lord, and I don't want your men dying on this causeway today." The silence stretched. A gull landed on the causeway wall between them, realized the situation was strange, and departed. Catherine looked at the dragon, looked at Aegon, looked at his men. "We'll withdraw," he said, "in good order." "I expected nothing less," Aegon said, and meant it. He turned his horse and rode back to the fortress at the same unhurried pace he'd ridden out, and didn't look back, and felt Vhagar's approval like warmth across the bond between them, a kind of animal satisfaction. Sir Miles was waiting at the gate. He had the expression of a man chewing something sour. "You rode out alone," he said. "I came back alone too," Aegon said, dismounting. "No harm done." "The harm that could have been done wasn't done," Aegon said, handing his reins to a stable hand. "Catherine's a man of honor. He wasn't going to shoot an unarmed man on a causeway in front of 800 witnesses." Miles walked beside him into the courtyard. "You can't do that every time." "I won't need to every time. This time it was right." He stopped, turned to face his old trainer. "Miles, if I'd sent 400 men down that causeway, what happens?" Miles considered. "A fight. We probably win, but we take casualties. His men take casualties. And then his lord sends a rider to Robert with a story about Targaryen forces slaughtering Stormland soldiers on the coast of Blackwater Bay. Which is a story Robert will use. He needs a story. He needs me to be a monster coming to burn the realm. Because if I'm not a monster," Aegon spread his hands, "if I'm a prince who rides out alone and offers bloodless withdrawal, that's harder to fight. You can't make a speech to your war council about dragons and fire if the dragon hasn't burnt anything yet." Miles was quiet for a moment. "Your father thought the same way," he said finally. "Tell me." He believed that if he could just talk to Robert, just lay out the truth of it, Lyanna, the marriage, the child, all of it, that a war could be avoided. He was wrong. Some men can't hear certain truths because hearing them would require becoming a different person, and Robert Baratheon has never wanted to be a different person. He looked at Aegon steadily. I'm not saying you're wrong to try. I'm saying know when to stop trying. I'll know, Aegon said. How? Aegon looked back at the gate in the direction Catherine's force had gone. When the first arrow flies, he said, that's when. The ravens went out that night. Serana had drafted them all over the preceding 12 days, one for each of the great houses, calibrated to each recipient with the particular care of someone who understood that the same message lands differently depending on who reads it. The one to Dorne was warm, historically aware, full of references to the alliance between the Targaryens and House Martell and the shared grief of Elia's death. The one to the Reach was formal and appealing to dynastic stability. The one to the Arryns was brief and factual, because Lady Lysa, recently widowed, was unpredictable, and the less she could react to, the better. The one to Winterfell, Aegon had written himself. He'd sat with it for an hour before writing a single word. Then he'd written it in one go, without crossing anything out, which was not usually how he wrote things but felt right for this particular letter. Lord Stark, my name is Aegon Targaryen. My mother was Lyanna Stark, your sister. I was born at the Tower of Joy in the Red Mountains of Dorne, and I believe you were there, or arrived just after. I am not writing to ask for anything. I am writing because you deserve to know I am alive, and that I am well, and that I know who I am. I have always known. I was raised well and with love by people who believed in the rightness of this cause. I intend to take back what was stolen. I would very much prefer to do it with the North's blessing than without it, but I would understand if you need time. You are an honorable man in an impossible position, and I have no wish to make it harder. I look forward to meeting you. Your nephew, Aegon, Jon, if you prefer. He sealed it and gave it to Hallyne. Hallyne held it for a moment, just holding it, and then went to send it with an expression on his face that was beyond Aegon's ability to fully read. Something that lived in the territory between grief and relief, in the specific country of people who have been carrying a secret for so long that letting it go feels like losing a limb and breathing freely at the same time. On the 5th night at Dragonstone, Aegon climbed to the highest tower and sat on the parapet with his back against a stone dragon's head and watched the Blackwater Bay glitter in the dark. Somewhere beyond that water, King's Landing slept. The Red Keep. The Iron Throne. His. He thought about Robert. He tried to be fair about it, because he'd always believed that understanding your enemy was more useful than hating them. He tried to see it from Robert's side, a young man who had loved a girl, or believed he had, and lost her to his friend's brother in a way that rewrote everything he'd thought was true, who had fought a war on the back of that grief and won it, and found, on the other side of winning, that the girl was still dead and the war had cost everything and the throne felt less like a prize than a sentence, who had been sitting in that sentence for 17 years, getting larger and angrier and more drunk, ruling badly because ruling had never been the point. The point had been her, and she was gone. Aegon felt something complicated about Robert. Not sympathy exactly. Not forgiveness, but a kind of human recognition, the recognition that the man he was coming to overthrow was not a simple villain but a tragedy, a king-shaped wound that the realm had been bleeding from for nearly 2 decades. It didn't change anything. The throne was still stolen. The blood was still spilled. His family was still dead. But it meant that when he finally came to King's Landing, he wanted Robert to understand why this was happening, not fear it. Understand it. V'Heger landed on the adjacent parapet with the quiet sureness of a creature who owned whatever surface he chose to occupy, and his great head swung around to look at Aegon with one enormous violet eye. I know, Aegon said without speaking. I know. We'll be patient a little longer. The dragon blinked once slowly. Then he settled his chin on the stone and looked out over the bay with his rider, both of them watching the dark water and the distant lights, and the night was very quiet and very large around them, and the throne was close enough to see if the darkness had just been a little thinner. But darkness never quite worked that way. Soon, though. Soon. Chapter 3. Letters Written in Ash. The Raven reached Winterfell on a gray morning when the first real cold of autumn was coming down from the mountains. The kind of cold that didn't ask permission, that walked through walls and settled into stone, and reminded everyone in the north that summer was a rumor now and winter had opinions. Ned Stark was in the great hall when Maester Luwin brought it to him. He was eating breakfast with his children, or attempting to, which was a different thing entirely because eating breakfast with Starks under the age of 16 was less a meal and more a managed negotiation. Robb was arguing with Jon about something to do with a sword technique. Sansa was eating with precise, elegant efficiency and pretending the argument wasn't happening. Arya had somehow gotten a piece of bread into her left hand and a throwing knife into her right, and appeared to be using one to think about the other. Bran was asking Hodor something that Hodor was answering with the full sincerity and limited vocabulary available to him. It was, in its chaotic way, Ned's favorite part of any day. Luwin came in quickly, which was unusual. The Maester was a man who moved at one speed in all circumstances, deliberate, considered, the walk of someone who had learned that haste communicated alarm and alarm was almost never useful. When he moved quickly, Ned noticed. "My lord," Luwin said, and his voice was careful in a way that made Robb look up from his argument and Arya stop spinning her knife. "A raven from Dragonstone." The hall went quiet. Ned set down his cup. "Leave us," he said to the children. "Father," Robb started. Robb stood, shot a look at Luwin's face, and shepherded the younger ones out with the efficient authority of a 15-year-old who had learned to read his father's tone. Arya went last, and she shot a look back at the Maester's hands, at the rolled parchment, that suggested she had already decided she would find out what was in it by some means or another. Then the hall was quiet, just Ned and Luwin and the Raven message between them. Luwin held it out without speaking. Ned opened it. Read it again. The fire in the hearth cracked. Outside, the wind moved through the Winterfell towers with its low, private sound. Ned sat very still, the parchment in his hands, and the words on it rearranged the world into something that had always been true and that he had always known, and that was still, even now, even after all these years of carrying the secret, completely undoing to see written down in someone else's hand. "Jon, if you prefer." He folded the letter precisely, the way a man folds something he intends to keep. "My lord," Luwin said. "Is it?" "Send no response yet," Ned said. His voice was steady. It surprised him. "And tell no one." Luwin nodded, the slow nod of a man absorbing something enormous. "Then, he is alive." "He is alive," Ned confirmed. They looked at each other across the table, two men who had each, in their way, been carrying the weight of the same secret for 17 years, and the relief and terror of it were indistinguishable from each other. Ned spent 3 days not answering the letter. He rode out each morning before dawn, alone, which he hadn't done in years, and rode the same circuit through the Wolfswood that he'd ridden as a boy when something was too large for walls. The trees were enormous and old, and they didn't ask questions. The horse didn't care about Targaryen succession. The cold air was simply cold. He thought about Lyanna. He always thought about Lyanna when things became impossible. Not because thinking about her helped exactly, but because she had been the kind of person who made impossible things seem slightly less absurd by existing. She had been 20 when she died, which he found more staggering with every passing year, 20, which was practically a child by the time you were 40, Practically a child who had somehow contained enough of everything to inspire a war and change the entire shape of a dynasty and leave behind a son who was apparently, from the evidence of one letter, spectacularly fine. I know who I am. I have always known. I was raised well and with love. Ned had not cried since Lyanna's funeral, which he'd attended alone on the quiet isle with just Howland Reed and a Septon. He'd paid very well to stay quiet. He came close on the second morning, out in the Wolfswood, reading the letter for the 11th time with frost on his breath and a gray sky overhead. Then he put it away and turned the horse home. On the 4th day, he sat down and wrote back. He didn't tell Catelyn first, which he knew was a mistake even as he made it. But the truth of the letter's contents was the truth of a secret he'd kept from her for 15 years. And there was no way to tell her the letter's contents without telling her the secret. And there was no way to tell her the secret in the time available, with a raven sitting in the rookery waiting for a response. With the political situation in Westeros reorganizing itself around the fact that a Targaryen prince with a dragon had just landed at Dragonstone. Without it becoming something rushed and defensive and wrong, he would tell her, he would, but not like this. He wrote to his nephew instead, and every sentence cost him something. Aegon, he wrote, or Jon, I'll use both if you'll permit it. I received your letter. I have read it more times than I'll admit. There are things I owe you that cannot be put in a raven message, and I intend to say them to your face when the time comes if you'll grant me that. I need you to know that what I did, the name I gave you in my mind, the story I told myself about what happened to you, was done for your protection. Or I believed it was. Whether I was right is something I think about every day. The North remembers, as they say. I am not yet in a position to speak for the North, but I am in a position to say that I am glad you are alive, and that your mother loved you. She said your name before she said anything else. Give me time and give me proof when we meet. Not because I doubt you, because the North will need more than a letter. Your uncle, Eddard Starkey, sealed it, took it to Lewin himself, and stood watching the raven diminish into the gray sky with a feeling in his chest that was too big to have a name. Robb found out about the raven the same day Ned sent his response, because Robb found out about everything eventually. The boy had his mother's intelligence and his father's persistence, which was a combination that made secrets difficult. He came to Ned's solar in the late afternoon, closed the door, and stood with his arms at his sides in the unconscious posture of someone who is trying to look patient and not succeeding. A raven from Dragonstone, Robb said. Lewin won't tell me what it said. Neither will you. He paused. And you've been riding out alone every morning for 3 days. That's not your business, Ned said. Father, a dragon was seen over Dragonstone 4 days ago. 3 separate ravens have confirmed it from our Blackwater contacts, from Lord Celtiger's old steward who apparently still lives in the area, and from a fishing captain who came into White Harbor 2 days ago saying he'd seen a black dragon the size of a warship flying over Blackwater Bay. Robb put his hands on the desk. There are Targaryen rumors running through every holdfast south of the neck. People are saying that someone landed at Dragonstone and the garrison just opened the gates. He met his father's eyes. Who is it? Ned looked at his son for a long time. He thought about all the years he'd carried this. He thought about Lyanna's voice, promise me, Ned, and he thought about the letter in his pocket and the raven he'd just sent. And he thought about the world rearranging itself with or without his permission. And he thought about the fact that Robb was 15 and would need to lead this family through whatever came next, and that leading a family through something you didn't understand was how good men made terrible mistakes. Sit down, Ned said. Robb sat. Ned told him. Not everything, not yet, not the full weight of it, but the essential truth, Lyanna's marriage to Rhaegar, the child, the Tower of Joy, the name Ned had given the boy in his mind across 17 years of absence, the name his sister had breathed out with her last breath, the name that was in neither case the boy's true name. Robb sat very still through all of it, very, very still. When Ned finished, the room was quiet for a long time. Jon, Robb said. He meant the Jon he knew, the Jon he'd grown up with, his best friend and almost brother, the boy they'd both believed was Ned's bastard. Our Jon. Aegon, Ned said. His name is Aegon. Robb absorbed this. Is he stopped, started again. What is he like? Ned thought about the letter. I know who I am, I have always known. From the letter he seems. He picked the word carefully. Certain. Robb looked at him. Certain how? Like a man who has never doubted his own direction. Ned folded his hands. I don't know if that's comforting or terrifying. Both, Robb said immediately, then quieter. He's the rightful king. Yes. Robert stole the throne. Yes. Then we don't do anything yet, Ned said firmly. Not until I've met him, not until I have proof in front of me, and not until I've spoken to your mother. He met Robb's eyes. This stays between us, do you understand? Arya will find out. Arya finds out everything, that's why I said between us. Despite everything, Robb almost smiled. 300 miles south of Winterfell in the Red Keep, Cersei Lannister received her raven on the same day. She read it alone in her chambers, which meant she read it 3 times through without her face doing anything at all, the particular blankness she wore when something was serious enough to require complete internal control. Then she set it down on the table beside her wine, and looked out the window at the city below, and did not touch the wine. Aegon Targaryen, 6th of his name. Born at the Tower of Joy. Dragon confirmed at Dragonstone. She thought about Joffrey asleep down the corridor. She thought about Miachella and Tommen. She thought about the Iron Throne in the room below, the way it caught light through the high windows, the way it had always seemed to Cersei to be a presence more than a piece of furniture, a gravity, a pull, the most expensive trap ever built. Then she called for Jaime. He came quickly, in the way he always came quickly for her, not because he was obedient, but because the bond between them pulled the same as gravity. He was still in his white armor, just returned from something, his golden hair catching the candlelight. He looked at her face, and his expression shifted from ease to attention in the space of a heartbeat. "What is it?" he said. She handed him the raven. He read it. His face did several things while he read. When he looked up, the ease was entirely gone. "Gods," he said. "Yes. He has a dragon. Yes." Jaime put the parchment down. He walked to the window she'd been looking at and stood with his hands braced on the sill, looking at the same city. "Robert needs to know." "Robert is hunting," Cersei said. "He's been 3 days out, and he's drinking more than he's hunting, and he'll be back tomorrow smelling like a distillery, and wanting someone to tell him what a great warrior he still is." She came to stand beside Jaime at the window, close enough that their arms almost touched. "Robert will want to ride to war immediately. He'll want to call the banners and sail for Dragonstone and fight a dragon personally, because that's who Robert is. He is magnificent at fighting, and he has never understood that there are problems you can't solve with fighting. You want to handle this before he gets back. I want to have already handled the first part of it by the time he gets back." She looked at Jaime sidelong. "Who do we have?" He understood the question. "Father," he said immediately. She had known he would say it. She had already decided the same. The thing about Tywin Lannister was that he was the one person in any room who could be counted on to not panic, not because he was brave in the conventional sense, but because panic required you to imagine consequences before you'd fully map the variables, and Tywin never left a variable unmapped. "Send him a raven tonight," she said. "Tell him what we know. He'll want to come to King's Landing." "Good. That's exactly what I want." She turned from the window. "And Jaime, keep this from Robert until Father arrives. I'll manage Robert's mood. You manage the information." Jaime looked at her with the complicated expression he wore when she was being brilliant and terrifying in equal measure, and he couldn't decide which he found more compelling. "You know Father will see this as an opportunity as much as a threat. That's why I'm calling him," she said simply, and then she picked up her wine. At Casterly Rock, 200 miles west, Tywin Lannister received his raven in the morning. He was not surprised. He was, in fact, the least surprised person in Westeros to receive news of a Targaryen heir, because Tywin had been operating on the assumption for approximately 12 years that Aerys' bloodline was not as thoroughly extinguished as Robert preferred to believe. He had made certain quiet preparations. He had kept certain contacts. He was not a man who left the world organized around a single assumption without building alternatives. He read the Raven, set it down. Read it again, which meant it had genuinely surprised him in some detail. A dragon, not Daenerys, a separate claimant, apparently male, born at the Tower of Joy, which meant Rhaegar's child by Lyanna Stark. He turned this fact over in his mind with the methodical pleasure of a craftsman examining an unusual piece of work. Rhaegar's son, which meant this Aegon, if legitimate, was not merely a Targaryen claimant. He was specifically the product of the Targaryen dynasty and House Stark, which was possibly the most politically powerful bloodline combination in Westeros since the conquest. He was 19. He had a dragon. He had taken Dragonstone without a battle. He had apparently met a Stormland's force of 800 soldiers at the causeway, ridden out alone, talked them into withdrawing, and done it all without a drop of blood being spilled. Tywin spent a long time looking at the wall above his fireplace, which had a map of Westeros on it. A very detailed map because Tywin believed in good maps. Then he called his steward and told him to prepare a traveling party of 40, not an army, not a show of force, just 40 well-armed men and fast horses. "For King's Landing, my lord?" the steward asked. Tywin considered. Then, "For the Kingsroad," he said. "East first, and send a raven ahead, not to King's Landing." "To Dragonstone." The steward blinked. Tywin's stewards were trained not to express surprise, but this one was young enough that the training hadn't fully taken. "To, my lord, should I address it to?" "To Prince Aegon Targaryen," Tywin said. Sixth of his name. The raven from Casterly Rock arrived at Dragonstone on a cold, bright morning 10 days after the landing. Serana brought it to Aegon without comment, which meant she'd already read it, which she always did with incoming correspondence, because she had decided some time ago that information management was too important to leave to formality, and Aegon had long since stopped being bothered by it. He was on the painted table when she brought it. He'd taken to spending time there in the mornings, not strategizing exactly but thinking while looking at the map, which he found useful in a way he couldn't entirely explain. Vhagar was outside on the walls, visible through the window, apparently sunning himself with the self-satisfied languor of a creature who had no natural predators and knew it. Aegon read the Raven. "Tywin Lannister wants a meeting," he said. "Yes." He addressed it to Prince Aegon Targaryen, sixth of his name. "I noticed that too." He set the parchment down. "What's his angle?" Serana pulled out a chair across the table and sat, which she did when she was going to say something she'd already thought through completely and wanted him to hear the whole thing before reacting. He settled back. "Tywin Lannister has hated the Targaryens since Aerys humiliated him publicly for 20 years, she said. "He sacked King's Landing. He let his son kill Aerys rather than stopping it. He sent Ilya's children to Robert Inna." She paused, and the pause itself was a kind of anger she was mastering. "He has every reason to be your enemy and no obvious reason to contact you civilly." "Except," Aegon said. "Except he's also the most pragmatic man in Westeros, and pragmatic men don't have permanent allegiances, only permanent interests, and his permanent interest is the power and legacy of House Lannister." She folded her hands. "Robert is dying. Maybe not today, maybe not this year, but he's a man destroying himself by degrees. When Robert falls, Joffrey sits the throne, and Joffrey is Cersei's son," Aegon said. "Not Cersei and Robert's son, Cersei's. He'd had the same intelligence report Serana had. He'd read the implication of Jon Arryn's death carefully. Exactly. And Tywin knows what Joffrey is. He probably knows before anyone else. She leaned forward slightly. If Joffrey takes the throne, the Lannisters have power, but they have it in the name of a boy king who will eventually become a man king, and who has, by all accounts, exactly none of his grandfather's intelligence and exactly none of his father's physical courage. Tywin spent his whole life building Lannister power. He's not going to hand it to Joffrey's incompetence. So he wants a deal, Aegon said. He wants to see if there's a deal to be made. There's a difference. Aegon turned the raven over in his hands. He wants me to be someone he can manage. He wants to find out if you are, which means the meeting itself is a test. Then I pass it by being someone he can't manage, Aegon said, while also being someone he'd rather have on his side than against him. Serana looked at him for a moment. You know, occasionally you make strategy sound very simple. It is simple. It's the execution that's hard. He set the raven down. Send him a response. Tell him I'll meet him. Not here, he shouldn't come to Dragonstone. That's too much concession before we've even spoken. Tell him I'll meet him at Duskendale. Neutral ground, good harbor, close enough to King's Landing that he'll respect it as serious, but far enough that he can't trap me. He paused. And tell him to come with 40 men or fewer. Serana raised an eyebrow. How did you know? His steward's raven mentioned he was preparing a traveling party. 40 is the exact number a man brings when he wants to look like he's not bringing an army. She stared at him. Hallyne taught me Tywin, he said. He's been teaching me Tywin since I was 14. I know how that man thinks better than most of his own family. Serana was quiet for a moment, then very quietly, You've been preparing for this specific conversation for 5 years. 6, he said, give or take. She stood up, picking up the raven message. I'll send the response. Serana, she stopped. What do you make of him? Genuinely, your read. She turned around and she wasn't smiling, but there was something in her eyes that was adjacent to it. The expression she wore when the world was moving correctly, and she was allowing herself to notice. I think Tywin Lannister is going to walk into that meeting in Duskendale expecting to find a boy with a dragon, she said, and I think he's going to find something considerably more alarming. Good, Aegon said. In King's Landing, the small council was in an uproar that it was trying to disguise as controlled deliberation, which was not working. Grand Maester Pycelle had turned a particular shade of gray that suggested his body was handling the news through complexion change. Lord Renly Baratheon, Robert's younger brother, pretty and clever in equal measure, was sitting with his hands folded and his face carefully neutral, which meant he was thinking hard about something he didn't intend to share. Littlefinger had a small smile that hadn't moved in 3 days, which was either because he found the situation delightful or because he'd already found a way to profit from it and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Varys sat across from Littlefinger with an expression of mild concern that fooled nobody, and was already in the privacy of his very capable mind, updating a considerable number of plans. The Master of Laws, Lord Stannis Baratheon, was not in the capital. He was on Dragonstone, or rather, he had been on Dragonstone, until approximately 11 days ago when Aegon Targaryen had arrived in Stannis, with the pragmatic survival instinct of a man who can count and had counted the dragon, had quietly removed his family from the island and sailed, to where nobody was entirely certain. Robert had come back from his hunt on the morning Cersei had managed, and he had heard the news in the way Robert heard all bad news, with a roar that shook the hall, a fist on the table, and 2 broken wine cups. Then he'd called for his armor. Cersei had spent 2 hours talking him down from the immediate military response, and had used up a considerable amount of political capital in the process. Robert was still furious, but he was also, and this was the part that Cersei understood better than anyone in the room, frightened. Not of the dragon, not of the claim, but of the truth that the claim carried. Because if Aegon was real, if the marriage was real, if the documentation was what it appeared to be, then the story Robert had been telling himself for 17 years, the story in which he was a hero reclaiming a kingdom from a mad king, in which Lyanna had been a captive and Rhaegar her captor, became considerably more complicated. Robert could handle enemies. He'd always been good at enemies. It was the truth he couldn't handle. Back on Dragonstone, on the night after the Raven from Casterly Rock arrived, Aegon and Serana sat in the chamber off the painted table, smaller than the main hall, with a fire going and a bottle of good arbor wine that Celtiger had produced from somewhere, and went over the state of things with the particular honesty they reserved for nights when no one else was around. The great houses, so far. Dorne was sympathetic, their contact reported. The Martells had not forgotten Elia, would never forget Elia, and while they wanted promises and proof, they were leaning toward support. The Reach was cautious, House Tyrell was watching. The Iron Islands didn't care about Targaryens or Baratheons particularly and were waiting to see which way the wind was blowing. The Vale was in internal chaos since Jon Arryn's death. The Riverlands would follow whoever the North followed, and the North. Has he responded? Serana asked. She didn't need to specify who. Not yet, Aegon said. He will. You're certain? He wrote back once. He'll write again. He swirled the wine in his cup. He's an honorable man. The honorable thing once you've acknowledged someone is to keep talking to them. He knows that. Serana was quiet, looking at the fire. You said he'd need time, she said. He's had time. He spent 15 years with the secret. He spent 3 days with the truth of it being public. Aegon set down his cup. He's not afraid of it. He's afraid of what it costs. Those are different things. And what does it cost him? Aegon thought about this honestly. Everything he told himself about why he kept quiet, every justification. Every night he looked at the stars and told himself the boy was better off not knowing, or better off hidden, or better off as a bastard than a target. He paused. I'm not angry at him for it. He made the choice he could make with what he had, but meeting me means confronting the fact that it was still a choice. Serana looked at him directly. You're not angry at him at all. A little, he admitted, which was the most honest thing he'd said about it. Not for the hiding, for the name. He gave me a Stark name in his head. He called me Jon, which means every time he thought about me, he was thinking about a Stark, not a Targaryen. He picked up his cup again. I'm not Jon Stark. I was never going to be Jon Stark. I'm glad Hallie named me something true. You still use Jon, she said. With me. With you, he said. It means something different. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at the fire. And the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that had its own structure, built over years of being in the same room with someone until silence became its own form of conversation. Tywin's meeting, she said. What do you actually want from it? His neutrality at minimum, his endorsement at best. He stretched out in the chair, easy. He's not going to support me out of loyalty. He's going to support me out of calculation if he supports me at all. I need him to calculate correctly. And if he calculates against you, Aegon smiled just slightly, then I make sure the cost of calculating against me is higher than the cost of calculating for me. Using the fact that I know about Cersei's children. He let that sit. If Joffrey is not Robert's son, then the Lannister position is built on a lie that will collapse the moment it's public. Tywin knows this. He knows I know it, or will assume I do. And he knows that I'm not Robert. I'm not going to go charging around making accusations that destabilize everything before I've consolidated enough to handle the fallout. I'll hold the knowledge like a card. Don't play it unless you have to, she said immediately. I wasn't planning to, but Tywin needs to know it exists. She was quiet for a moment. Then, there's another thing. The Vale. The Vale, she confirmed. Lady Lysa has a son, Robert Arryn, and she's increasingly unstable. If Littlefinger is doing what I think Littlefinger is doing, Littlefinger is always doing several things at once, Aegon said. None of them for anyone's benefit but his own. He's noise. I won't plan around noise. Noise starts fires, Serana said. Then I'll be faster than the fire. She almost smiled. Then softly, you know what I think about sometimes. When I think about all of this, all the planning and the politics and the moves and countermoves, tell me. I think about the moment when it's done, she said. Not the throne, not the victory speech. Just the morning after. What does that morning look like? He looked at her across the fire for a long moment. Quieter, he said finally. That's what I hope. Just quieter. She nodded slowly. Something in her face was open in the way it very rarely was, the guard down, just Serana looking at the fire and being for a moment the girl who had grown up on a volcanic island hoping for a world that was fairer than the one she'd been born into. He didn't say anything else. Sometimes the right response to an honest moment was to let it be what it was. Outside, the sea moved against the rocks, and Vihegar called once from the high walls, a sound like thunder asking a question, and the fire burned low, and somewhere in the darkness beyond Blackwater Bay, the pieces were all moving, every great house calculating, every lord looking at his raven with different arithmetic. The board was set. The players were in motion. And Aegon Targaryen, sitting by a dying fire with the girl who was the closest thing he had to a home, felt the currents of history shifting under his feet like the tide coming in, enormous and slow and absolutely, completely inevitable. Chapter 4. The Lion's Gambit. Duskendale in autumn smelled like salt and old rope, and the particular anxiety of a port town that had suddenly found itself at the center of something very large. The harbor master had received 3 separate ravens in 2 days, one from Dragonstone, one from Casterly Rock, and one from King's Landing that he'd burned immediately, because the King's Landing raven had come with instructions from the small council telling him to refuse the Targaryen fleet docking rights. And the harbor master was a practical man who understood that refusing a fleet with a dragon was a position that sounded much better in a council chamber than it did on an actual dock. He'd sent a polite response to the small council, explaining that he was happy to comply with the directive, and that perhaps one of the council members might like to come deliver it personally to the dragon. He had not received a reply. So Aegon's ships came into Duskendale Harbor on a bright, cold morning with Vihegar circling overhead, and the town watched from windows and doorways with the particular expression of people witnessing history, and not entirely certain how they felt about it. Aegon came off the ship with Serana at his right shoulder and Sir Miles at his left, followed by 40 of the second sons in their best armor, which was not particularly shining, but was absolutely functional and worn by men with the particular stance of soldiers who had fought in multiple campaigns and were now, with dragon support, in an exceptionally good mood about their current employment. The Lannister party was already at the inn. They'd arrived the previous evening. Aegon's scouts had confirmed it. 40 men on fast horses, all wearing subdued colors, no lions on display, which was almost comically unlike the Lannisters, but told you everything about the nature of this particular meeting. Even Tywin understood that arriving in full house colors to meet a Targaryen claimant on neutral ground was the wrong signal. You came as a man to this kind of meeting, not as a banner. He's had 12 hours to prepare, Serana said, walking beside Aegon through the harbor street. He'll have intelligence on everything we've done since landing, possibly earlier. Good. It means we don't have to explain the basics. He'll have a position ready, an opening gambit. He always has an opening gambit, Aegon said. That's fine, I have one too. Which is, being exactly who I am. He glanced at her. It's the one thing he won't have prepared for. Serana looked like she wanted to ask a follow-up question but was deciding against it. She'd learned over the years that there were moments when Aegon was assembling the final form of an approach, and interrogating the process interrupted it. So she stayed quiet and matched his pace and looked at the town around them with the alert, cataloging attention she brought to every new place, counting exits, noting choke points, identifying the 2 Lannister scouts she'd spotted in the crowd within 40 seconds of leaving the dock. "The man by the baker's stall," she said quietly, "and the woman pretending to sell cloth." "I see them," Aegon said. "Tywin's thorough. He's Tywin." He said it without heat, almost admiringly. He'd be less interesting if he wasn't. The inn was called the Driftwood Crown, which Aegon found either auspicious or ironic depending on how the next few hours went. The innkeeper, a stout woman with the resigned face of someone who had been told extremely important people were coming to use her establishment, and had understood immediately that she would have no say in the matter, had cleared the main room on the ground floor and provided a table, chairs, wine, and cold meat that nobody was going to eat. Tywin Lannister was already seated when Aegon walked in. He looked exactly like his reputation, which was unusual. Most powerful men were either more or less than described, but Tywin was precisely his reputation, as if the stories about him had been assembled from direct observation by someone with very good eyes. He was in his 60s, lean and hard in the way of men who had never allowed themselves softness, with green eyes that were intelligent in the specific way that was uncomfortable to be looked at by. He was dressed simply, dark gray, good fabric, no ornamentation beyond a small golden ring on his right hand. He did not stand when Aegon entered. Aegon noticed and let it go without the flicker of a reaction, which he suspected was itself information for Tywin to process. He pulled out the chair across the table and sat, which meant there was a moment where both of them were seated without formal acknowledgement from either direction. 2 men at a table, equal by mutual decision. Serana took a position standing at Aegon's right shoulder. Sir Miles stood at the door. The second sons were outside. Tywin's people arranged themselves with similar economy. For a moment nobody spoke, and the silence had a quality to it, not awkward, not tense, but deliberate, as if both men were allowing the meeting to find its own shape before they started filling it. Tywin spoke first. "You're younger than I expected." "You're exactly as I expected," Aegon said. Something moved in Tywin's eyes. Not offense, not amusement exactly, recognition. The look of a man recalibrating slightly. "Someone prepared you for this meeting." "I prepared for this meeting. Halling gave me the materials." Aegon settled back in his chair. "I've been studying you since I was 14 years old, Lord Tywin. Your campaigns, your decisions during the rebellion, your handling of the Rains and Tarbex, the way you constructed Lannister power after your father spent 20 years dismantling it." He paused. "I find you genuinely impressive, which is why I agreed to meet you, and genuinely dangerous, which is why I brought 40 men. Tywin looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his wine cup and drank, and when he set it down, the slight adjustment in his posture said, without saying anything, that he had revised his assessment upward and was deciding how to proceed from the new position. "You took Dragonstone," Tywin said. "I came home," Aegon said. "The distinction matters to you." "The distinction is the argument," Aegon said. "I didn't take Dragonstone, I reclaimed it. I didn't invade Westeros, I returned to it. Robert Baratheon won a war. Winning a war establishes control, not legitimacy. The Iron Throne belongs to House Targaryen by right of conquest, by 300 years of rule, and by blood. My blood." He looked at Tywin steadily. "You know this. You knew it when you sacked King's Landing. The question is what you're going to do with the knowledge." Tywin set his cup down. "What I did in King's Landing was necessary," he said, "and there was no apology in it, but there was something else, a weight old and carried. Aerys would have burned the city. The wildfire caches were real. I made a choice." "I know about the wildfire caches," Aegon said. "I know Jaime Lannister killed Aerys to prevent the burning. I know what Aerys was, what he became." He held Tywin's gaze. I'm not my grandfather. I have no interest in being my grandfather. I'm also not my father, though I think my father was right about more than history has credited him with. A pause. What I am is the rightful king, and I intend to rule as one, which means I need the realm to function when the dust settles. Destroying everything Lannister in the process of taking back what's mine would be stupid, and I'm not stupid. Tywin studied him. You're offering me something. I'm not offering you anything yet, Aegon said. I'm establishing what I'm not. What I'm not is a mad king looking for revenge. I'm not a conqueror with no plan beyond the conquest. I'm not someone who needs the Lannisters to kneel before I'm willing to consider them. He paused. What I am is interested in what you actually want, because I think what you actually want is something I can work with. Tywin was quiet for a moment. It was the quality of quiet that cost him something. A man who was extremely accustomed to being the one who asked questions, and was now doing the unusual thing of answering one. I want Lannister power to survive and strengthen, he said. Simple. Direct. Tywin Lannister, when he decided to be honest, was aggressively honest, which Aegon had expected and respected. I want my family's legacy to be something other than the house that served a usurper. I want stability, because stability is the environment in which power compounds. And Cersei's children? Aegon asked. The room went very still. Tywin's face did nothing, absolutely nothing, but his hands resting on the table were very slightly more still than they had been, the stillness of control rather than ease. What about them? He said. They're her children, Aegon said. By blood and by love, I understand that. I also understand that the question of their paternity, if it ever became public, would destabilize everything, Robert's claim, Joffrey's succession, the entire political architecture that you've spent 20 years helping construct. He held Tywin's gaze without blinking. I'm not interested in destroying Cersei's children. They're children. Whatever their parentage, they didn't choose it, and I'm not in the business of punishing people for their parents. He let that sit. But you should know that I know, because it means you can stop calculating around what I might discover and start calculating around what I'm choosing to do with it. Another long silence. Serana, at his shoulder, was very still, and he could feel, without looking, that she was watching Tywin's face with the total attention of a woman who had spent her life reading people. Tywin said, "You're blackmailing me." "I'm not blackmailing you," Aegon said. "I'm being transparent with you about what I know so that our negotiation happens in reality rather than performance. There's a difference." He leaned forward slightly. "I could blackmail you, Lord Tywin, but blackmail creates enemies who are waiting for you to relax. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in allies who are allies because the arrangement benefits them genuinely." He spread his hands. "Help me take the throne peacefully. Help me manage Robert's removal from power in a way that doesn't burn the realm down. And in return, House Lannister's place in the new order is not just preserved, but elevated legitimately on the basis of their genuine capabilities, which are considerable." Tywin was quiet for a long time. Outside, the harbor sounds continued, gulls rigging, the knock of hulls against the dock. The world indifferent to the history being made in the driftwood crown. "You're asking me to move against my daughter," Tywin said finally. "I'm asking you to move against Robert Baratheon," Aegon said. "What happens to Cersei afterward is a question of what Cersei does. If she accepts the new order gracefully, her children are safe. Her position is honored, and the rest is negotiable. If she fights," he paused, "I hope she doesn't fight." "You hope," Tywin said, and there was the ghost of something in his voice, not quite contempt, not quite admiration, something that lived in between. "I'm practical about hope," Aegon said. "I hope and I plan for the alternative." Tywin picked up his wine again, drank slowly, set it down. "There is another matter," he said. "Stannis," Aegon said. Tywin's expression adjusted by a degree. "You anticipated. Stannis Baratheon believes he's the rightful king after Robert." Aegon said. He doesn't claim it loudly, but he believes it absolutely, which is more dangerous than loud claims because it means he'll never stop. He's on Dragonstone, or he was until I arrived. He paused. I actually want to talk to Stannis. He won't talk to you. He will, Aegon said simply. Because Stannis is the most rigidly honest man in Westeros, and when I show him the documentation of my parents' marriage, he'll have to acknowledge its legitimacy. He may hate it. He will almost certainly hate it. But he can't deny it because denying it would require him to lie to himself, and Stannis Baratheon does not lie to himself. Tywin looked at him. What makes you so confident about men you haven't met? I've met them in books, Aegon said, in letters, in the choices they've made that other people recorded. A man's decisions are his character written in action. He looked at Tywin directly. You decided to come here rather than send an envoy. That tells me you needed to see for yourself. You decided to come with 40 men rather than a large force, which tells me you're treating this as a conversation, not a confrontation. You acknowledged Aerys' madness without being asked, which tells me you're capable of admitting uncomfortable truths when the audience is appropriate. He paused. You are exactly the man your decisions have made you, Lord Tywin. So is Stannis. So is Robert. Another silence. This one had a different quality, not negotiating silence, but the silence of a man doing something very quietly significant inside his own mind. Then Tywin said, The Reach. Aegon nodded. House Tyrell is watching, Tywin said. Mace Tyrell is a fool, but his mother isn't, and Lady Olenna will back whoever she believes will win with whoever she can negotiate the best position for. Right now she's waiting. He looked at Aegon steadily. If I send word to Highgarden, not my support but my absence of opposition, Olenna will read it correctly. And what does she want? Her granddaughter, Tywin said. Margaery, she wants her on the throne. Aegon was quiet for a moment. Serana, at his shoulder, was very carefully not reacting. I'm not making marriage promises in Duskendale, Aegon said. That's not what this meeting is. No, Tywin said, but the possibility should exist. The possibility exists for anyone of appropriate standing and character, Aegon said evenly. I won't rule it out and I won't rule it in. That's all I'll say today. Tywin seemed to find this acceptable. He leaned back slightly, the first physical relaxation he'd shown since Aegon entered the room. There is one more thing, he said. Cersei's counter-move, Aegon said, and that was when the door opened. It wasn't dramatic. It was a scout, one of Aegon's own, a quick young man from the Second Sons named Ferrys, who opened the door with a face that said he'd been running and had bad news and was trying to calibrate how bad to look about it. My prince, Ferrys said. Riders on the northern King's Road, about 2 miles out, flying gold cloaks and Lannister banners. He caught his breath. 500 roughly, moving fast. Aegon looked at Tywin. Tywin looked back at him with the expression of a man who had not ordered this, and was now recalculating what it meant that it had happened anyway. Cersei, Tywin said. One word, and the way he said it contained an entire relationship. His frustration, his grudging admiration, his awareness that his daughter had anticipated this meeting, and moved to disrupt it before its outcome could be used against her. She hadn't sent these men to arrest Tywin. She'd sent them to complicate Aegon, to force his hand before a deal could be made, to make him fight before he could negotiate, to make him look like a conqueror before he could establish himself as a returning king. It was intelligent. Aegon gave her that. How long? He asked Ferrys. 20 minutes, maybe less. He stood. Miles, he said to the door. Already moving, Miles said from outside he'd heard. Aegon turned to Tywin. I'd like you to stay inside, he said. Not as a prisoner, as a witness. Tywin looked at him. To what? To how I handle this, Aegon said. And then he walked outside. The King's Road came into Duskendale from the north on a straight approach that meant you could see the dust long before you heard the hoofbeats. Aegon stood in the street outside the Driftwood Crown and watched it come, his 42nd sons arrayed behind him with their own particular efficiency. The town had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when everyone has noticed something happening and moved indoors to watch from windows. Serana appeared at his side. "Cersei's gambit," she said. "She wants you fighting before Tywin commits." "I know. What's the play?" He looked at the dust. 500 riders, gold cloaks and Lannister colors. Someone had ridden through the night to get them here in time, which meant Cersei had anticipated this meeting days ago and prepared a response before he'd even sent his acceptance. He felt a genuine respect for that. Cersei Lannister was not his enemy because she was stupid. "Vhegar," he said. Serana glanced at him. "Just Vhegar. Just Vhegar. No fighters, no advance. Just him and me and Vhegar overhead and let them decide." She looked at the approaching dust. "And if they don't decide in your favor, then we'll have a battle," he said. "But they will." She held his gaze for a moment and then nodded once, not agreement exactly, but the acknowledgement that she trusted his read even when she was not yet sure of it herself. He reached upward, inward along the bond. "Vhegar, come down, low, slow, beautiful." The response was immediate, temperature and motion, and something that felt like eagerness, a coiled energy releasing. From somewhere over the harbor, a black shape appeared and grew, enormous against the gray sky. Wings spread to their full span, that violet inner light running along the scales as Vhegar banked and turned and came low over the Kingsroad approach. Not attacking, not flaming. Just present, just the full, impossible, ancient reality of him. 300 feet of wingspan and old fire, and the most singular biological fact in the current world. The Lannister column stopped. Not an ordered halt, a disruption, horses shying, the lead riders pulling up hard, the column concertining against itself as the rear ranks ran into the suddenly stationary front. The gold cloaks scrambled. Commands were shouted. Several horses left the road entirely. Vhegar came down to 50 feet above the street, directly between the column and where Aegon stood, and hovered, which dragons weren't supposed to be able to do for long. But Vhegar had his own opinions about what was possible, his downdraft hitting the Lannister riders like a physical force, carrying with it the smell of ash and ancient fire. Aegon walked forward, not running. Just walking down the middle of the street, toward the column, with Vhegar above him and the town watching from behind its shutters. The commander of the Lannister force was a knight Aegon didn't know, young, well-armored, clearly good at following orders, and currently in the unenviable position of having been sent to do something that had become significantly more complicated than advertised. His horse was wide-eyed and fighting the bit. "I know you didn't choose this assignment," Aegon said, stopping 20 feet from the commander's horse. His voice was conversational. "You were given an order and you rode through the night to execute it, and I'm sure you're a competent soldier and a loyal man." He glanced up at Vhegar, then back. "But you were sent here to force a confrontation that your queen wanted to happen before a certain meeting could conclude. The meeting has concluded." He paused. "So there's nothing left here to confront. You can ride back to King's Landing and tell Queen Cersei that you arrived after the fact, which is true, and that further military action at Duskendale was inadvisable, which is also true." The commander stared at him. His horse was still trying to get away from the dragon. "In the name of King Robert Baratheon is not my king," Aegon said, without heat, without drama, just clearly. "He is a man who won a war 17 years ago and has been sitting in my family seat ever since. I'm coming to correct that. The question for every person in Westeros, including you, including your men, is which side of that correction they want to be on." He looked at the soldiers behind the commander, the long line of gold cloaks and Lannister men in their armor, horses stamping, Vhegar above them, all like a piece of the ancient world made present. "I'm not asking you today. I'm just asking you to go home." The commander looked at Vhegar, looked at Aegon, looked back at his 500 men, who were in various states of managing their horses and trying to look like they weren't all quietly desperate to leave. "We'll withdraw," the commander said. Exactly the same words Catherine had used on the causeway. Something about Aegon apparently produced that particular response, which he was beginning to think was less about him and more about the fundamental human preference for having a reasonable exit available. He stepped aside. The Lannister column turned, not gracefully but adequately, and started back north. Vehiger tracked them from above for about a mile and then banked off, circling back to land with a heavy thump on the driftwood crown's roof, which Aegon suspected the innkeeper was not going to be happy about. He walked back into the inn. Tywin was standing at the window. He had watched the whole thing. He turned when Aegon came in, and his expression had done something, not much. Tywin Lannister's face was not a place where things happened obviously, but something. A recalibration. A recognition. "She sent them to make you fight," Tywin said. "I know. You didn't." "I know." Tywin was quiet for a moment. Then, "She'll send more next time, and she'll be angrier." "I know that too," Aegon said. "That's why I want this settled before she has time to escalate." He sat back down, poured wine into both cups. "My lord, are we done with the preliminary negotiations, or do we need another hour?" Tywin looked at him across the table for a long moment. Something in his bearing had shifted subtly, the way a tree shifts when the wind changes direction, still the same tree but differently oriented. He sat down. "Tell me what you want from Casterly Rock," he said. They talked for another 3 hours. Not everything was resolved. Nothing this large could be resolved in an afternoon in a harbor town inn with the dragon sitting on the roof. But the shape of something emerged, the outline of an arrangement that was not yet an alliance, not yet an agreement, but was distinctly more than nothing. Tywin would not march against Aegon. His men would not fight for Robert in any campaign against Dragonstone. He would send a private communication to Lady Olenna that could be read by a sufficiently intelligent person, as endorsement by implication. In return, Lannister lands, Lannister titles, Lannister power, untouched in the new order. Jaime, if he chose it, was welcome to retain his position, though the Kingsguard would be reformed. Cersei's children would not be punished for their parentage. Cersei herself, Tywin did not ask for her safety explicitly, but the question of it shaped the whole conversation, present in what wasn't said, and Aegon addressed it directly. She will have every opportunity to accept the change. What she does with that opportunity is hers to choose. Tywin had accepted this with the careful expression of a man who knew his daughter and was already calculating how to manage her reaction. They shook hands at the end. Tywin's grip was very firm and very dry, the handshake of a man who kept promises because breaking them was inefficient rather than because honor required it. "You said you've been studying me since you were 14, Tywin said, standing. "Yes. What conclusion did you reach?" Aegon picked up his gloves from the table. "That you are the most capable political mind in Westeros," he said, "and that you've spent your whole life building something that the wrong king could destroy in an afternoon." He looked at Tywin directly. "I intend to be the right king." Tywin held his gaze. "See that you are," he said, and walked out. The sun was going down over Duskendale Harbor when Aegon and Serana walked back to the ship, the second suns moving around them, the town gradually exhaling after its long-held breath. Vehiger was in the air again, a black shape against the orange sky. Serana said nothing for a long time. "Then the Lannister riders, when you walked out to meet them," she paused. "I had 40 men ready." "I know you did. You didn't look back once." "I knew you were there," he said. "That's enough." She was quiet again. They reached the dock. The ship's plank was down, the crew busy with evening preparations. He stopped at the base of the plank and turned to her, and he saw something in her face that she hadn't quite gotten back under control, the aftermath of the afternoon's tension, the relief and the something else that was adjacent to it. "You were frightened," he said, not as an accusation, just a fact. "Don't be smug about it," she said immediately. "I'm not. He stopped. Then carefully, "I didn't know you were frightened. I should have. I'm sorry." She looked at him, and the guard was down again, the way it had been by the fire on Dragonstone, that rare and particular honesty. "It's not that I thought you'd lose," she said. "It's that, watching you walk out there, just walking like it was nothing." She stopped, looked at the harbor. "You're not afraid of anything, Jon. It's your greatest strength and the thing that's going to give me gray hair before I'm 30. He almost said something deflecting and didn't. "I'm afraid of things," he said. "Name one." He looked at her. "Losing people I can't replace," he said quietly. The harbor water moved between the ships. Somewhere a gull called. Serana held his gaze, and the thing between them that had been building for years, that they had both, by some mutual unspoken agreement, chosen not to name yet because naming it too early would be wrong and they both knew it, sat right there in the evening air, present and patient. Then Miles's voice came from the ship above. "Are we leaving or not? The tide's going to be inconvenient if we wait much longer." Serana looked up at the ship, and the guard came back, and she was herself again, composed, precise, a small smile at the corner of her mouth that was real. "We're coming, Sir Miles," she called. She went up the plank first. Aegon followed and didn't look back at Duskendale, because the next thing worth looking at was ahead. 3 days later, Serana was standing at the prow when the arrow came out of the cliff above the coastal passage south of Dragonstone. It was not a good shot, too steep an angle, moving target, sea wind. It clipped her left shoulder and glanced off, which was the difference between a graze and something considerably worse. She went down to one knee from the impact, her hand going to the shoulder, blood showing immediately between her fingers. Aegon was beside her in approximately 2 seconds. She looked up at him, her face white, controlled, furious at herself for being hit more than at whoever had shot her. "I'm fine," she said. "It's a graze. Don't." He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the cliff. The cliff where the shooter was already running, visible for a moment against the skyline, 2 figures moving fast with the built agility of trained soldiers, not opportunistic assassins. Trained. Sent. Cersei's work or someone's, an attempt to remove the woman at his right shoulder, maybe, or a message, or simply the opening move of a harder campaign. He felt something very cold settle in his chest. Not fear, not grief, not yet, because she was alive and talking and bleeding less than she would have if the shot had been 2 inches more central. But something that lived in the territory beyond anger, a kind of absolute clarifying determination that burned clean and steady, the way a forge burns when the bellows are opened. "Get her below," he said to Miles, quiet and even. "Jon," Serana said. "Below," he said, and looked at her, and something in his face made her stop arguing, which told him the face was saying what he was feeling more clearly than he intended. He stood up, looked at the sky, and called Vehiger down. The dragon came fast, not the lazy banking circle of a patrol, but the folded wing stoop of a creature that had read its rider's state and understood that this was different. He came down to 20 feet over the water, close enough that the downdraft hit the ship, his head swinging immediately toward the cliff, following Aegon's gaze with an intelligence that was entirely its own. Aegon pointed. Vehiger didn't need more than that. He went up the cliff face with 3 wing beats, his shadow blacking out the rock, and the violet flame came, not the full, city-eating torrent of old tales, but a precise and controlled burst that crossed the cliff top like a door being shut. One figure made it off the far side before the fire reached them, the other did not. The ship's crew on deck was very quiet. Aegon stood at the railing and watched the cliff burn for a moment, the damp grass sending up dark smoke, the stone itself blackened. Then he turned and went below. Serana was sitting with her back against the cabin wall, while a ship's surgeon, more accurately, a man who had learned field medicine through the educational process of watching a lot of wounds and trying different things, cleaned the graze with a focus that suggested he was extremely aware of how important his patient was, and intended to communicate this importance through his level of care. The shoulder was not serious. Clean graze, no bone, muscle superficial. She would have a scar and a bruise and would be annoyed by it for approximately 2 weeks, which was a different outcome from the one that would have applied if the angle had been slightly less steep or the wind slightly less inconvenient. She looked up when he came in, read his face. "You fired," she said. "Yes. One of them. One got away." He sat down across from her, looked at her shoulder, looked at her face. "You told me you were going to be fine. I am fine. I know, but you were almost not fine." She held his gaze, and hers was very steady, the steadiness of someone who had considered mortality and made her peace with its general vicinity, the way soldiers did, the way people who had grown up planning a war did. "This is what we signed up for," she said. "Not you," he said. "Not specifically you." She was quiet for a moment. The surgeon finished his work and found somewhere else to be with the efficient discretion of a man who understood that the room had changed in character. "The one who got away will report to Cersei," Serana said, because she was Serana and the operational implications came first always. "She'll know the attempt failed and she'll know you responded with fire. She'll use that, let her use it," Aegon said. "I'm done being patient with Cersei Lannister's assassins. It might not have been Cersei. Then whoever sent them should also be concerned." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at her directly. "I need you to stop getting shot. I wasn't trying to get shot. I know, I'm asking for a preventative effort." She almost smiled, which meant the shock was wearing off and she was herself again, which was the specific thing he'd needed to confirm since he'd come down those stairs. "I'll do my best," she said dryly. "That's all I ask." He stayed there a while, not saying anything else, just present, which she didn't object to, which was itself information he turned over in his mind as the ship moved on south, and the burning cliff receded behind them and the sky turned the deep gray of late afternoon. Above, on the deck, he could hear Miles organizing the watch rotation with his characteristic gentle fury. The crew moved. The sails filled. The sea was cold and wide and Westeros was close now, its politics tightening around them like a net drawing in. He thought about Cersei. He thought about Tywin's face when the riders had been turned back, that recalibration, that recognition. He thought about the Iron Throne and the cost of things, and the morning after Serana had described that Aegon hoped for, just quieter. He was beginning to understand, in a way that was physical as well as intellectual, that getting to the quiet morning was going to cost something significant. Not just blood and battle, something more personal, something that happened in the space between who you were when you started a war and who you were when you finished it. He intended to finish it as himself. He was just going to have to make sure that was still possible when the time came. Chapter 5. What the North Remembers. The Kingsroad north of the Neck was empty in the way of roads that had been deliberately emptied. No traders, no wandering septons, no small folk moving between villages. Just the road and the cold and the flat, enormous sky of the north pressing down on everything like a hand. Aegon rode with 20 men. Serana had argued for 50. Sir Miles had argued for 100. Aegon had listened to both of them with genuine attention and then said 20, and the conversation had ended there, because they had both learned, through different routes and at different costs, that there were decisions where arguing past a certain point was waste. Her shoulder was healing. 8 days out from the coastal attack, she moved her left arm with only occasional evidence of the graze, which she hid with moderate success, and which Aegon noticed with complete success, and said nothing about. because she'd made clear she didn't want it acknowledged, and he respected that. They'd left the ships at White Harbor, in the care of Celtigar and Durin and the Second Sons, with instructions clear enough that Miles had reviewed them twice and only found one thing to criticize. Durin had clapped the old knight on the shoulder and told him the plan was fine and that worrying was bad for the complexion. And Miles had looked at him with the expression of a man considering violence, and then apparently deciding against it on grounds of efficiency. The Stark banners appeared on the horizon in the early afternoon, outriders, far enough back to be non-threatening, close enough to say we know you're here and you're expected. Aegon watched them appear and felt something shift in his chest, a pressure he hadn't named that he realized, when he finally paid attention to it, was the accumulated weight of 18 years of approaching this specific moment without quite reaching it. He was about to meet his uncle. He was about to meet the man who had been at the Tower of Joy, who had held Lyanna's hand, who had heard her last words and carried them in silence across 17 years. He kept his pace even and his face neutral, and told himself that the feeling in his chest was manageable, which it was, and told himself it didn't matter, which it wasn't, and rode on. Winterfell announced itself gradually, the way great northern things did, not the sudden drama of a cliff or a canyon, but an accumulation, the land rising slightly, the trees thinning, the gray towers appearing against the gray sky in a way that made it difficult to determine exactly when you'd first seen them. By the time the castle was clearly visible, it felt like it had always been there in your peripheral vision, waiting to be noticed. Aegon had read descriptions of Winterfell his entire life. Hallyne had given him the Stark histories, the records of the castle's construction over 8,000 years, the additions of each generation, the hot springs running beneath the stones that kept the castle warm even in deep winter. He knew the Great Hall and the God's Wood and the Broken Tower, and the layout of the wards better than he knew the layout of Dragonstone, which he'd only recently visited for the first time. Knowledge of a place and seeing it were different things. The direwolf banners on the towers moved in the northern wind, gray wolves on white fields, and the castle gates were open. In the yard inside, a group of people was waiting. Aegon read them from a distance with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years learning to assess rooms before entering them. Ned Stark in the center, which was expected. A red-haired woman beside him who held herself with the stiffness of someone maintaining composure through effort, Catelyn Stark, who had been told something significant and recently, and was not fully at peace with it. A young man of 15 or 16 who was Robb, obviously Robb, the same coloring as his mother, but with something in the set of his jaw that was purely Northern Stark. And behind Robb, trying to look like she was standing casually and not at all hiding behind her brother's shoulder while simultaneously looking directly at everything with enormous gray eyes, a girl of about 11 who could only be Arya. Aegon pulled up in the yard, dismounted. His 20 men arranged themselves behind him with quiet efficiency. He looked at Ned Stark. Ned looked at him. The look lasted perhaps 3 seconds and contained approximately 17 years of complicated feeling on both sides, and the yard was very quiet while it happened. Then Ned Stark crossed the distance between them and stopped close enough to speak quietly. "You have her eyes," Ned said. His voice was very controlled. The control itself was informative, the effort of a man keeping something large from overflowing. And his cheekbones, I wasn't certain what I'd see, but he stopped, swallowed. "You look like both of them." "I'm told that," Aegon said, and then because it was true and this was the time for true things, "I don't know what to call you." Ned's jaw worked slightly. "Ned," he said, "if you can. I know I have no right to ask for anything informal, but—" "Ned," Aegon said. "That's fine." They stood there for a moment, both of them navigating something that had no established protocol because it had never happened before, the reunion of two people who had been connected for 18 years by a shared secret and a shared absence. meeting for the first time as strangers who were not strangers. Then Catelyn Stark stepped forward, and the careful social mechanics of greeting took over, which was almost a relief. The great hall of Winterfell was warm in a way that surprised him, the hot springs beneath the floor, just as described, but descriptions hadn't captured the particular quality of it. The way warmth came up through the stone rather than down from a fire, ambient and encompassing. He sat at the high table with Ned on his left and a cup of northern ale in his hands, and looked at the hall filling with Stark household, and thought about the fact that these were his mother's people. Robb sat across from him. The boy was trying hard not to stare, which meant he was managing approximately 4 seconds between direct looks before the compulsion one. "You can just look," Aegon said. "I don't mind." Robb looked up, caught, then recovered with the grace of someone who had decided embarrassment was optional. "Sorry, I've thought about this since Father told me." "When did he tell you?" "About 2 weeks ago." Robb glanced at his father, then back. "He told me the essential facts, the tower, the marriage, who you are." "And?" Aegon asked. Robb was quiet for a moment, assembling something honest. "And I thought the North should have known sooner," he said. "Not because it would have changed the rebellion, it was already done by the time you were born, but because you should have grown up knowing where you came from. Both halves." He held Aegon's gaze. "The North is part of you, even if you were raised in Essos, even if you never set foot here before today." Aegon looked at him, this young man who was his cousin and who had arrived at that particular truth through 15 years of being a Stark and knowing what that meant. "I know it is," he said. "I grew up with the stories." Hallyne was thorough. "What stories?" "The Kings of Winter, the Long Night, the Wall." He paused. "Your grandmother, my grandmother, Lyanna, her gardens, the way she sang." He watched something move in Robb's face. Hallyne loved her. He talked about her more than almost anyone. Robb was quiet for a moment. Then, "He taught you to love a place you'd never seen." "He taught me to love the idea of it," Aegon said. "The place itself I'm only now learning." He looked around the hall. "It's better than the idea." Robb almost smiled. Then did. Arya found him after dinner, not accidentally. She had clearly been waiting for an opportunity with the focused patience of someone who had identified a goal and was waiting for the optimal moment with better tactical discipline than most adults. He was walking through the lower corridor toward the guest chambers when she appeared at his elbow from a doorway that he was fairly certain had been unused. "Can you actually talk to the dragon?" she said, without preamble. He looked down at her. 11 years old, short for her age, with gray eyes that were asking a completely genuine question with the directness of someone who had decided that social filtering was other people's problem. "Yes," he said. "How?" "I think about what I want," he thinks back. "Thinks what?" "Temperature, feeling, movement." He considered how to explain it. "Imagine if you and your direwolf ghost is Jon's," she said, then stopped. "The other Jon." "My hour." She looked briefly frustrated with the grammar of her family situation. "Your brother," Aegon said simply. "Jon Snow, he's your brother. That doesn't change because of who I am." She looked at him, and something in her 800-year-old gray eyes assessed this answer and found it acceptable. "He has Ghost, and Robb has Greywind, and I have Nymeria." Her chin came up slightly. "If I asked Nymeria to do something, could she?" "Probably. The bond is there. Whether you've learned to use it is different." "How do you learn?" "You stop thinking about it like giving commands," he said. "It's not a command, it's a conversation without words." She chewed on this. "I want to see Vhagar. Tomorrow, in daylight, where I can introduce you properly." She looked like she was going to push for tonight and then made the calculation that proper introduction was probably better. "Fine," she said, "but tomorrow first thing." "First thing," he agreed. She turned to go, and then over her shoulder, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" she considered. "A king, you know, all formal and distant." She looked at him directly. "You're just a person." "I'm both," he said. "I know," she said, like this was obvious. "That's what I mean." And then she was gone, back through the small doorway, leaving him in the corridor with the feeling that he'd just been assessed by someone considerably more perceptive than her years suggested and had apparently passed. Ned came to his chambers late that night. He knocked. Aegon was awake. He'd been sitting at the window, looking at the gods' wood, the white-barked heart trees visible in the moonlight, the weirwood faces with their red sap that looked like old wounds. Hallyne had told him about weirwoods. Seeing them was different again from reading about them. "Come in," he said. Ned came in and sat in the chair across from the window without being invited and without being awkward about it, the ease of a man in his own house sitting with someone he needed to talk to honestly. He had a cup of something, wine or ale, and he held it without drinking it. "I owe you a conversation," Ned said. "You don't owe me anything," Aegon said. "I do." He looked at the weirwoods. "I'm going to say it, and I'd ask you to let me finish before you respond, because I've been composing it for about 2 weeks, and if I stop I might not start again." Aegon nodded. Ned looked at the white trees and spoke. He told it from the beginning, not the political beginning, the personal one. Lyanna, 14, 15, 16, increasingly ungovernable in the loving way of someone who contained more spirit than the world knew what to do with. Her engagement to Robert, which she had not refused but had never quite embraced either. The rumors about Rhaegar, the tournament at Harrenhal, the crown of winter roses. He told it without defending himself and without defending Lyanna and without defending Rhaegar, just told it as it had been, complicated and human and running faster than anyone's ability to manage it. Then the tower, the journey south, the Kingsguard at the base of it, 3 of the finest knights in the realm, dying in the dust to give Lyanna time, Howland Reed bleeding at his side, the stairs, the door, the room. "She was dying when I found her," Ned said, and his voice was very even, the evenness of a man who has described something terrible enough times that the telling has worn smooth, though the thing underneath remains unchanged. "I knew it as soon as I saw her. There was nothing to be done. She knew it too." He paused. "She made me promise." "To keep me hidden," Aegon said. "To keep you safe," Ned said. The words were about safety. I made it about hiding. He looked at his cup. "I told myself it was the same thing. For a long time I was able to tell myself that. Then, as you grew up in my mind, the idea of you, the boy I imagined you becoming somewhere across the sea, I stopped being able to maintain the distinction." Aegon looked at him. "What do you think it cost me?" Ned met his eyes. "I think it cost you the North," he said. "Your mother's half, the Stark blood in you, you knew it was there, you had books and stories, but you didn't have this." He gestured vaguely at the castle around them. "The stones, the cold, the people, the way the hall smells in winter." "Robb," he stopped. "You should have had Robb growing up beside you." A pause. "And Jon," Aegon said, quietly. Ned's face did something complicated and private that he didn't quite manage to conceal. "Jon is also your nephew," Aegon said, "by a different route." He held Ned's gaze. "I've been thinking about how to say this since I wrote the letter. Jon Snow grew up in Winterfell. He had the stones and the cold and Robb and Arya and everything I didn't have, and he still grew up being told he was a bastard, which was its own kind of theft." He paused. "You were trying to protect both of us with a story that couldn't protect both of us at the same time. I understand that. It was an impossible position." Ned looked at him for a long time. "You're not angry," he said, and the way he said it, not a statement, not exactly a question, suggested that the anger was what he'd been preparing for and the lack of it was unexpected in a way that was almost harder. "A little," Aegon said. "I told Serana the same thing, a little." He looked at the weirwoods. "But I grew up knowing who I was, knowing my name, knowing my blood, trained by people who believed in me completely. I had a dragon. I had Hallyne. I had Serana." He turned back to Ned. "I'm not going to stand in Winterfell and tell you I was robbed, because I don't believe that's true. I think we both lost something. I think you lost something significant, 17 years of watching me grow up, and I think you paid for the choice more than I did." Ned was quiet for a moment. Then he put his face in his hands just briefly, just for a second, and then took them away and was Ned Stark again, composed and northern and holding himself together by the sheer force of a lifetime's discipline. "She would have loved you," he said. "She would have. She was exactly like you, actually. That certainty. That particular way of moving through the world like it owed you nothing, and you expected nothing, and everything was still going to go your way." His voice was rough. "She would have laughed at her own jokes in your presence and embarrassed both of you and loved every second of it." Aegon felt the words land in his chest, held them there. "I know," he said. "Halling told me about the jokes." Ned laughed, actually laughed, short and rough, the laugh of a man who hadn't expected to laugh tonight. "Gods, Halling, of course he told you." He shook his head. "He was her favorite. She used to steal his quills and blame it on the other children, and he always knew and never told." They sat there for a while after that. The two of them, uncle and nephew, Stark and Targaryen, in the room above the gods' wood where the white trees kept their old and patient watch. And the conversation became quieter and more ordinary. The kind of ordinary that only comes after the big things have been said, when two people discover that they can simply be in the same room without the weight of everything they were supposed to say. It was, Aegon thought, as close to family as he had ever felt. The morning was bright and bitter cold, the kind of northern clear that made everything sharp-edged and overlit. Arya was in the yard at first light, as promised, standing with her arms crossed in a posture that was entirely her own, a mixture of determined and slightly trying to appear like she hadn't been waiting for 20 minutes. Aegon came out of the great hall and nodded to her. She fell into step beside him. They walked to the north field, past the training yard where 3 household guards were already at their forms, past the stables, through the postern gate, to the wide, flat ground beyond the castle walls. Aegon stopped and looked at the sky. Arya looked at the sky too. "Watch," he said. He called Vhagar, not with urgency, just the steady presence of the bond and invitation. 30 seconds passed. Then the sound reached them first, that rhythmic percussion that had no natural equivalent, and then the shadow, and then Vhagar came over the northern wall of Winterfell and landed in the field with a concussion of air that made the frozen grass lie flat. Arya didn't flinch. She just looked. Vhagar looked back at her with one enormous violet eye, his head tilted at the particular angle he used when something had caught his genuine attention. "He's looking at me," Arya said. "He's deciding what he thinks of you." "What does he think?" "He's curious," Aegon said. "He can feel what I feel about the people I'm with. I'm comfortable here. He's interested in why." Arya took one step toward Vhagar. The dragon's head tracked her without moving his body, the precision of a creature that could remain absolutely still while still being entirely alert. She stopped about 10 feet away. "Can I touch him?" she asked. "Ask him," Aegon said. She looked at him. "What?" "Don't ask me, ask him." He paused. "You said last night that you want to use your bond with Nymeria properly. Start with this. Not words, just reach toward him, see what you get back." Arya turned back to Vhagar, and her face went thoughtful in a way he hadn't seen from her before. All that kinetic energy quieted, focused. She stood very still. The dragon watched her. The cold morning held them both. Then Vhagar lowered his head very slowly and rested his chin on the ground between his forefeet. Arya's face broke open into the most uncomplicated joy Aegon had seen since arriving in Westeros. She walked forward and pressed her hand against the side of Vhagar's jaw, and the dragon exhaled slowly, warm breath steaming in the cold air. "He's warm," she said, surprised. "Dragons run hot." "He feels old," she said, her hand still on the scales. "Not old bad, old like the trees, old like things that have always existed." "The blood of old Valyria," Aegon said. "It's in the dragons, it's in us too, though we feel it differently." She looked at him over the dragon's nose. "In me?" "Less directly, but Starks and Targaryens have been linked before today." He paused. "Your grandmother's blood is in you, Lyanna Stark, which means you carry something even if it's distant. Arya absorbed this with the thoughtful seriousness of someone incorporating it into an existing framework. Does that mean I could ride a dragon? Probably not. She looked disappointed. Don't be discouraged. The people who can ride dragons are vanishingly rare. What you have is the bond with Nymeria, which is its own extraordinary thing. He watched her with Vhegar, the dragon motionless and patient. A direwolf is the North's dragon, older in some ways. The first men had them before the Targaryens brought dragons across the sea. Is that true? It's what Hallyne says, and Hallyne is almost never wrong about old things. Arya scratched behind Vhegar's jaw in the softer area between the scales. The dragon made the low sound, the Growlper hybrid, and closed his eyes. Arya's expression was one of profound satisfaction. I like him, she said definitively. He likes you back, Aegon said. He's selective. Good. The declaration came 3 days after his arrival, in the great hall of Winterfell, with the household assembled and the fire high, and every lord within a day's ride having ridden through the night to be present, because the ravens Ned sent had been curt and direct in the northern fashion. Come to Winterfell. The matter is significant. 40-odd lords and their retainers, filling the hall, warm with fire and close-backed bodies, and the particular crackling alertness of men who had been told something momentous was happening, and had come to see it with their own eyes. Aegon stood beside Ned at the front of the hall, and he was not performing anything, not performing royal confidence, not performing Targaryen gravity, not performing Stark belonging. He was just himself, in black and red, with the evidence of his parentage spread on the table before him for any lord who wanted to examine it. Many had. Over the previous 3 days, Ned had brought them through in groups, the documents, the letters, the marriage contract, and Hallyne, who had made the journey north at a pace that had alarmed his knees, had answered every question with the patient authority of an old man who has been waiting to answer these questions for nearly 2 decades. Now Ned stood before his lords and spoke. You know the claim, he said. No preamble, no rhetoric. Ned Stark addressing his people sounded like the North itself, direct and cold and absolute. You've seen the evidence. Rhaegar Targaryen and my sister Lyanna were married. Her son is Aegon Targaryen, 6th of his name, rightful heir to the Iron Throne. He paused. Robert Baratheon won a war. He did not win legitimacy. The throne was never his by right, only by force. He looked at his lords. I kept this secret for 17 years. I am not keeping it any longer. The hall was quiet in the way of people who have been surprised by something they half expected. Lord Greatjon Umber, because he was the Greatjon and incapable of being quiet when quietness was an option, said from his bench. And you believe it, truly. I held him when he was hours old, Ned said, looking directly at the Greatjon. I heard my sister speak his name. I saw Rhaegar's letters and the marriage contract with the witnesses' seals intact. A pause. Yes, truly. Another silence. Then the Greatjon stood up. He was enormous, the Greatjon, built on a scale that made the hall seem smaller. He looked at Aegon for a long moment with small, shrewd eyes that were considerably more intelligent than his volume suggested. You have a dragon, he said. His name is Vhegar, Aegon said. I saw him come over the walls this morning, bloody enormous. He's mid-sized, actually. Gods help us. The Greatjon said, apparently to nobody in particular. Then he drew his sword. Every man in the hall tensed. The Greatjon drove the blade into the floor of Winterfell's great hall, point first, so that it stood there quivering slightly, and then he went to one knee behind it, a move that on a man of his size had an inherent drama that no smaller man could have replicated. The king in the north, he bellowed. And the hall erupted, not gradually, not reluctantly, but in the way of men who have been waiting for someone to say the thing first, who had felt the room moving in a direction and had been waiting for the first voice to give them permission to follow. The words went around the hall like fire finding dry grass, lord after lord on their feet, the sound building until the old stones shook with it. The king in the north. The king in the north. Aegon looked at the hall. He felt the sound move through him, felt the weight of it, the genuine and specific weight of standing in Winterfell and hearing his mother's people declare for him. He kept his face composed, but it cost him something, which was correct. The things worth having were supposed to cost something. Beside him, Ned Stark was looking at the hall with an expression that was beyond reading, too much in it. Too many years of kept silence finding their resolution in this loud, impossible moment. Arya, he could see, was standing at the back of the hall near Robb, and she was not shouting like everyone else, just watching him with those gray, stark eyes, and when she caught him looking she gave him a very small, very Arya nod. He nodded back. Afterward, when the hall had cleared and the lords were finding their beds and the fires were burning low, Aegon found Robb in the training yard. The young man was hitting a practice dummy with singular focus, the kind of rhythmic, purposeful violence of someone who has too many feelings and has found a physical solution. He stopped when Aegon came in, lowered the training sword. "I want to fight with you," Robb said. "Not for you, with you. There's a difference." "Yes." He was direct, Robb, in the way of someone who had learned directness from a father who considered it a virtue. "Fighting for you means following orders. Fighting with you means you treat me like a general, give me real command, listen to what I say even when you disagree with it." Aegon looked at him, 15 years old, broad-shouldered already, built like his father with his mother's coloring and neither one's tendency toward caution. "You've been thinking about that for a while," he said, "since you arrived. And you're telling me instead of your father because father would make it formal. He'd present it properly. I want to ask you directly, man to man, because that's how I want the whole thing to work between us." Robb met his eyes. "You're my king. I've accepted that. You're also my cousin, and I need to know which one I'm dealing with when I come to you." Aegon was quiet for a moment. He picked up a practice sword from the rack, tested its weight. "Both," he said, "always both, the same way I'm always both Jon and Aegon." He looked at Robb. "I want you as a general, genuinely, not as a courtesy to House Stark. I've read about you, talked to your father, watched you with the men since I arrived. You lead well and you don't know it yet, which is actually better than knowing it too early." Robb absorbed this. "My father says the same thing, but it's different when he says it, because from him it's parental, and from you, professional." He raised the practice sword. "Show me what you've got." Robb blinked. Then a grin broke across his face, the grin of a 15-year-old who had been having a very serious conversation and been abruptly redirected into exactly what he wanted to be doing, and he raised his own sword and came forward. They went at it for 20 minutes in the firelit training yard, their breath steaming in the cold, and it was good. Robb was genuinely good, aggressive, quick, with a natural understanding of space that Aegon recognized as the kind of thing you either had or didn't. He wasn't Aegon's level, not yet, but he was closer than most men twice his age, and he didn't flinch when Aegon went at him seriously, just adapted, looking for new angles. Aegon put him down twice, not brutally, just cleanly, the way you demonstrated a lesson, and both times Robb was back on his feet quickly, breathing hard and grinning. "You're fast," Robb said on the third recovery. "You're better than you think," Aegon said. "You pull your strikes when you think you've won. Don't." "I've been taught not to injure training partners." "I'm not a training partner. I'm your king and your cousin, and we're going to war together. Finish your strikes." He raised his sword. Again. They finished as the castle bells marked the midnight hour, both of them sweating despite the cold, and they sat on the fence of the training yard in companionable silence for a while, breathing out steam into the northern dark. "When do we march?" Robb asked. "South, 3 weeks, maybe 4. Aegon looked at the sky. "I want the North's forces at the Twins before the first snowfall." The phrase, "They hold the crossing," We'll need to manage them. Father says Lord Walder Frey can be managed with gold and the promise of a Stark alliance. Then we'll manage him with gold and the promise of something better than a Stark alliance. He paused. A royal alliance. That's a different commodity entirely. Robb nodded slowly. And south of the Twins, the Riverlands lords will fold quickly once the north is behind us. After that, he looked at the dark southern sky. After that depends on what Tywin does. You trust him. I trust his self-interest, Aegon said, which is consistent and intelligent. That's almost as reliable as trust. Robb thought about this. And King's Landing. Eventually, not yet. Robert needs to see what's coming before it arrives. He needs time to make a choice. He looked at Robb. I want Robert Baratheon to have every possible opportunity to understand what this is and what I'm offering. Which is a dignified surrender, Aegon said. His life, his legacy, his seat in the histories as a man who fought for what he believed in and chose wisdom over destruction in the end. He paused. He won't take it. I don't think he's capable of it, but I want it offered, clearly and repeatedly, so that when the end comes, every person in Westeros knows that it didn't have to happen the way it happened. Robb looked at him for a moment. That's cold, he said. Not a criticism, a recognition. It's honest, Aegon said. The night before departure, Ned found him in the God's Wood. The weirwood grove was silent and moon-white, the red-sapped faces watching from the tree trunks with their alien, patient attention. Aegon was sitting at the edge of the pool, looking at the reflection of the branches, and Vhagar was somewhere above the castle. He could feel the dragon's drowsy presence, half asleep and warm, untroubled. Ned sat beside him, two men at the roots of old trees, neither speaking for a while. Then Ned said, "There's something I haven't told you." Aegon looked at him. "Jon," Ned said. "Jon Snow, who is at Castle Black. I know. You understand that he also doesn't know his parentage, that I told him. He thinks he's your bastard," Aegon said. "Yes. I know," he looked at the pool. "He deserves the truth." "He does. Ned stopped. I've been a coward about it for years. I told myself it was protection, and then I told myself he was settled, and then I ran out of justifications and found I'd simply failed to do it." "You can write to him," Aegon said. "Tonight if you want. I'll wait." Ned looked at him. "You'd wait?" "He's my uncle, or," Aegon considered the genealogy. "Technically my father's younger brother's son, which makes him. The relationship doesn't have a clean word." He almost smiled. "But he's blood, and he's apparently excellent from what people say about him. Lord Commander Mormont thinks highly of him." "He is excellent," Ned said, and the pride in it was nakedly parental. He's more Stark than Targaryen, I think. He's serious and honorable, and he cares about things in that way that makes you want to be better when you're around him." He paused. "He'll struggle with what he is, more than you did, because he didn't grow up knowing." "Then I'll need to meet him," Aegon said simply. "And it'll be harder for him and easier for him than it was for me in different ways, and we'll work through it." He looked at his uncle. "Ned, write to him tonight. He deserves to hear it from you first." Ned nodded once, the nod of a man who had been given permission to do the thing he'd been needing to do for years and had needed someone to say it clearly. He stood. "Your mother would have," he started. "I know," Aegon said. "You don't have to keep saying it." "I'll keep saying it," Ned said quietly, "until I've said it enough times to feel like I've paid some part of the debt." Aegon looked up at him from the pool's edge. "There is no debt," he said. "Between you and me, there's no debt." Ned stood there for a moment, this hard and honorable man who had spent 17 years carrying something he should never have had to carry alone. And in the weirwood light, his face was uncomplicated in a way it probably hadn't been since long before all of this, since before the rebellion, since before the death of everything young and easy. He put his hand briefly on Aegon's shoulder, said nothing, then walked back through the God's Wood toward the castle. Aegon turned back to the pool, to the white branches reflected in still water, to the patient faces of the weirwoods watching from the trees. He stayed there a while longer, in the quiet that his mother had grown up with, in the cold that was her cold, in the dark that was older than anyone's ambition or grief or claim, and felt something settle in him that he hadn't known was unsettled. Then he stood. The North had declared. The march was set. 40,000 swords behind the Stark banners, moving south toward a throne that had been waiting 18 years for its rightful owner. Above the castle, Vihígar stirred, felt his rider moving, felt the direction of thought, and called once into the night sky, that long, wild sound. Aegon walked back through the gods' wood, and his step was steady, and he was ready, and the North spread out enormous and cold and absolutely, completely his behind him. Chapter 6. Fire and blood reclaimed. The army came down the Kingsroad like a slow tide finding its level. 40,000 northern swords, gray cloaks and direwolf banners, moving with the particular unhurried certainty of people who had decided something, and were not in any rush because the decision itself had already settled the matter. Robb commanded the van with a confidence that had been present in potential 3 weeks ago, and had since become actual. Something in him had clicked into place the moment the march began, the way certain people need the ground moving beneath their feet to become fully themselves. Behind the northern host, the second sons came up from the south along the Rose Road, where Durin had spent 3 weeks in negotiations with Reach lords whose political calculations had shifted considerably, since Tywin Lannister's conspicuous silence had become the most eloquent statement in Westeros. House Tyrell had not declared, but House Tyrell's smaller bannermen, reading the weather with the instincts of men whose livelihood depended on accurately predicting which way large things were going to fall, had mostly found reasons to decline Robert's call to arms. The Riverlands had folded almost before asked. Lord Tully was Catelyn Stark's father, and Catelyn Stark's husband had just declared for Aegon Targaryen, and Hoster Tully was an old man with bad health and a talent for recognizing arithmetic when it presented itself clearly. The twins had cost gold and a promise to include a Frey girl in some future court position, which Aegon had agreed to without blinking, because the crossing of the Green Fork was worth considerably more than the modest social advancement of one Frey daughter and Lord Walder, for all his legendary unpleasantness, knew a genuine offer from a condescending one. They crossed the neck in 8 days. They met the Riverlands host at the Ruby Ford, where the Trident ran shallow between painted stones, and Aegon stood on the bank and looked at the water and thought about his father. Rhaegar Targaryen had died at this ford, had died believing in something, the prophecy, the prince that was promised, some vast and necessary truth that the world wasn't ready to receive, and had been killed by a man who was right about nothing except being stronger in that specific moment. The rubies were supposed to be scattered on the riverbed still. Aegon didn't look for them. He didn't need to. He waded his horse across and kept moving. The first serious resistance came outside Harrenhal. 3,000 Lannister soldiers, not Cersei's gold cloaks but genuine Lannister men from the Westerlands, had taken position at the castle, or more accurately, at the road outside it, since Harrenhal itself was a ruin so vast and so extensively destroyed that it defied occupation except in the loosest sense. Their commander was a capable man named Sir Adam Marbrand, who had ridden hard to get here, and had arrived to find that his 3,000 were facing something considerably larger than anticipated. Aegon rode forward with Serana and Robb, their horses picking down the road toward the Lannister line in the gray morning, and he could see Marbrand at the front, a lean man, good armor, the particular expression of someone doing mental arithmetic that kept coming up wrong. "Sir Adam," Aegon called. Marbrand rode out to meet him, halfway between the lines with 2 of his captains. He looked at Aegon, looked past him at the host, looked at the sky where Vihígar was doing his slow circle. My prince, he said, and the title itself was a capitulation, a recognition that had slipped out before he decided to allow it. Your lord sent you here, Aegon said. Which lord? Marbrand hesitated. Then Lord Tywin's instructions were to hold this position. Did Lord Tywin instruct you to fight? Another hesitation, longer. His instructions were to hold. Holding doesn't require fighting, Aegon said. Holding means you're here, you've held. Your men can see my army and my dragon, and you've held your position until the last possible reasonable moment, which is now. You've fulfilled your lord's instructions. He paused. Stand aside, Sir Adam. Take your men back to the Westerlands. Send Lord Tywin word that you held your position until holding it was no longer strategically viable. He'll understand that language. Marbrand looked at him. At the army, at Vhegar, my men will not be harmed, he said. They will not be touched. Sir Adam Marbrand turned his horse around, rode back to his line, gave a series of quiet commands, and 3,000 Lannister soldiers peeled away from the road in good order, moving west, not running, just departing. Professional soldiers following professional instructions toward a professionally acceptable conclusion. Robb watched them go with something between admiration and frustration. We haven't fought anyone, he said, and it was not a complaint exactly, more a young commander noting something unexpected about the campaign's shape. No, Aegon said. At some point we'll fight, Aegon said. But every man who walks away from this instead of dying in front of it is a man who will be alive in the kingdom afterward. The kingdom I have to rule. He looked at Robb. You'll get your battle, cousin. I'm afraid it's unavoidable, but I'm not going to manufacture one for the experience. Robb absorbed this with the expression of someone having a useful lesson delivered in a context that made it genuinely legible. The Raven from King's Landing arrived in their camp outside Rook's Rest with the particular urgency of correspondence that had been delayed and knew it. Serana brought it to him in the command tent, where Aegon was going over the approach roads to King's Landing with Robb and 3 Riverlands lords whose names he'd been attaching to faces for the past week. She set it on the table without interrupting, but the way she said it, deliberately in his eyeline, said now. He opened it. It was from Varys. He'd never corresponded with Varys directly, but they had mutual channels, careful ones, maintained over years through intermediaries and Essos whose discretion had been confirmed repeatedly. Varys was a man of comprehensive interests and consistent pragmatism, and he had apparently decided that the moment for direct contact had arrived. The letter was brief and factual in the way of a man who understood that information was most valuable when undiluted. Robert Baratheon will not surrender. He has dismissed 2 small council members who suggested negotiation, placed Cersei under effective house arrest after discovering she had sent men to Duskendale without his knowledge, and is currently drinking with Sir Barristan Selmy, who has told him 3 times that a parley is worth attempting, and has been told 3 times to mind his sword and his silence. He intends to meet you in the field personally. He has been training. I tell you this not to warn you but to inform you, because what he is doing is not strategy. It is grief. Robert Baratheon has not processed a grief properly in 17 years, and he intends, I believe, to resolve his account with the world through this confrontation. Joffrey has been told nothing useful. Cersei is contained but not defeated. Tywin Lannister has not moved from Casterly Rock. The city is afraid. The city, if I may be so direct, is also ready. They have not loved Robert Baratheon for many years. They fear fire and they fear war. But they fear him less than they did, and they fear you less than you might expect. I have taken the liberty of ensuring that the city gates will not be barred from the inside when the time comes. Consider this a professional courtesy from a man who respects efficiency. Aegon read it twice. Then he looked at Serana. She'd read it over his shoulder. He's clearing the path, she said. He's betting on the winner, Aegon said. Varys always bets on the winner, which means he thinks you're going to win. He's thought that for some time. Aegon folded the letter. Robert in the field, personally. He was quiet for a moment. I don't want to kill him. Serana looked at him steadily. He may not give you a choice. I know, he set the letter down, but I want him to have one. They camped at the Blackwater Rush on the north bank within sight of King's Landing's walls. The city was visible in the early light, the towers of the Red Keep on its hill, the Sept of Baelor, the 1,000 fires of a city of 500,000 people going about the business of existing in uncertain times. Smoke rose from hearths, not from battle. The city breathed. Vhagar landed in the river shallows at dawn and drank, which was something Aegon had not seen him do before, perhaps the size of the water or the particular quality of the morning, and the sight of a dragon drinking from the Blackwater Rush, black wings folded, unhurried, would be talked about in King's Landing for a generation. The message came from Robert's camp mid-morning. Not a letter. A rider in Baratheon gold, carrying a war hammer on his saddle and a sealed message that was, when Aegon opened it, almost entirely free of diplomatic language. Come out and face me. Leave the dragon behind if you have any of the courage your father didn't. Robert Baratheon, first of his name, King of the Seven Kingdoms. Aegon read it, looked at it for a moment, handed it to Serana. She read it and her jaw tightened in the small way that meant she was controlling a strong reaction. He wants single combat. He wants to feel like himself again, Aegon said. Like the man who killed Rhaegar at the Trident, he wants one more moment of being that person. He looked at the city. If I leave Vhagar behind and meet him man to man, he gets to be a king. If I bring the dragon, he's just a man standing in front of a fire. Don't meet him without Vhagar, Serana said immediately. I'm not going to. Good. But I'm also not going to flame him from above and call it justice. He turned from the city. Send him a reply. Tell him I'll meet him on the Blackwater Plain between the camps at midday. Tell him to bring his war hammer if he wants. And tell him I'm bringing Vhagar, because I'm not insulting him by treating him as something less than what he is. A man I'm prepared to face with everything I have. Serana looked at him for a long moment. You're giving him the choice right up to the end. It's his world too, Aegon said. He built something. He held it together for 17 years badly, but he held it. He deserves the chance to understand why it ends. The Blackwater Plain was flat and cold, and loud with the particular quiet of two armies watching something happen that everyone understood was significant. Robert Baratheon came out at midday on a horse that was struggling slightly with its rider's weight, and even from a distance, Aegon could see what 17 years of reign had done to the man who had once killed a crowned prince in single combat. He was enormous still. That was the first thing. He had not shrunk, just expanded. The warrior's frame now padded with the evidence of too many feasts and too little purpose. He wore armor that had been let out and let out again, dented Baratheon black, the crowned stag on his breastplate. His war hammer was in his right hand, its head resting on his saddle. He had no escort. Aegon had to give him that. Aegon rode out with Serana, who he had told to stay back and who had told him with considerable brevity that she would not, and they had reached an understanding which was that she rode with him to within speaking distance of Robert, and then stopped. Vhagar landed behind Aegon and stood, not threatening, not poised to strike, just present, the way mountains were present as a fact of the world. Robert looked at the dragon for a long time. Then he looked at Aegon. Up close, the years were even clearer, not just the weight but something behind the eyes, a particular kind of exhaustion that wasn't physical, the exhaustion of a man who had been at war with himself for longer than any external conflict. His eyes were sharp, though, still sharp. Whatever Robert Baratheon had destroyed in himself across 17 years of bad kingship, he hadn't destroyed the intelligence, just the patience to apply it. "You look like him," Robert said. His voice was gravel and old wine. "Rhaegar." "So I'm told," Aegon said. "It's not a compliment." "I know." Aegon looked at him, not with hatred, not with contempt, just directly, the way you looked at something you needed to see clearly. "My name is Aegon Targaryen. Rhaegar was my father and Lyanna Stark was my mother. They were married. Their marriage was witnessed and recorded. The throne has been mine by right since the moment I was born." Robert's grip on the warhammer shifted slightly. His horse moved. "Your mother was stolen," he said. "Rhaegar took her. Rhaegar married her," Aegon said. "She chose him. She rode away from the tournament because she wanted to. She wrote letters, Robert. Letters to him in her own hand. I have read them." He paused, and when he continued his voice was quiet, not gentle but honest. "She did not love you, I'm sorry. She cared for you, she did not love you, not in the way you loved her. That is the truth. It is a hard truth. But you have been ruling a kingdom on the basis of a story that wasn't true, and 17 years of that it shows. It shows on you and on the realm." Robert's face went through something enormous and private, a landscape of expression that moved fast and left something stripped in its wake. "You don't know what she felt," he said, but the certainty was cracked. "I know what she wrote," Aegon said simply. "The same way I know that she was laughing when she was happy, and that she couldn't get to the end of a funny story without laughing at herself first. The same way I know that she was afraid at the end, but she was brave about it, and that she used her last breath to make sure I knew my name." He looked at Robert steadily. "She was extraordinary. You were right about that. And you have been spending your whole reign trying to hold onto something that was never yours to hold." The silence on the plain was total. Two armies watching. Robert looked at him for a long time. The war hammer rested on the saddle. His horse stood still. "I could kill you," he said. "You could try," Aegon said without heat. "I'm better than you are with a blade. Rhaegar is behind me. And 40,000 men are watching, which means that even if you managed it, the result would be the same. It would just cost more lives and make a worse story." He paused. "Or you could end this now. Abdicate. Live out your years wherever you choose. Your children are safe. I've given my word, and I keep my word. Step back from a throne that was never yours by right and let the realm begin to heal." Something moved in Robert's face. Not surrender, not yet, but a recognition, the beginning of seeing clearly, which was possibly the most painful thing that had ever happened to him, more painful than the hammer or the battle, because at least battle was external. "Lyanna chose him," Robert said, not a question, just saying it, trying on the shape of the true story. "She chose him," Aegon said, "and the war was fought on a misunderstanding that powerful men preferred to keep misunderstood." He looked at Robert directly. "You were the sword, Robert. You were brave and strong, and you fought for what you believed was right. You were used. By Jon Arryn, by your own grief, by Tywin Lannister, who wanted Aerys removed and saw an opportunity. You were a great weapon in a war that should never have been fought." He paused. "You were never supposed to be the king. That's not an insult. It's the thing that's been destroying you from the inside for 17 years, and I think some part of you has always known it." Robert looked at the war hammer in his hand. He looked at Rhaegar. He looked at Aegon. Then he looked at his armies behind him, and at the 40,000 to the north, and at the walls of the city he'd ruled for 17 years, and at the red keep on its hill where the Iron Throne sat in the throne room, that monument to a conquest that predated everyone alive. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had changed, something central, some resistance that had been the organizing principle of his existence for 17 years was gone. He looked older without it, and more human and more tired than any man had a right to be. "My children," he said, "truly safe." "Truly," Aegon said. "And Cersei's choices are her own to make. I'm not making them for her." He held Robert's gaze. "But I'm not her enemy unless she chooses to make me one." Robert was quiet for a long time. Then he turned his horse slowly and rode back toward his camp. Not fast, just steadily, the way a man walks away from something he's putting down because he's finally understood that carrying it was the problem. He did not look back. His camp was very quiet when he returned to it. Aegon sat on his horse and watched him go, and felt something complex and enormous move through him. Not triumph, not quite. Something that had more grief in it than triumph. The feeling of a thing ending that had cost too much on its way to ending. Serana rode up beside him. She said nothing, just present. He didn't surrender, Robb's voice came from behind. He had apparently ridden forward with the Great Jon and several other lords, all of them watching the retreating figure of the usurper with various expressions. Not yet, Aegon said, but he will. Robert Baratheon abdicated 3 days later. He signed the document in the throne room of the Red Keep, in the presence of Aegon's delegation and the remnant of the small council and Sir Barristan Selmy, who watched the proceedings with the face of a man trying to determine how many things he felt simultaneously, and whether any of them were contradictory. He signed it with a firm hand, which Aegon noted. Whatever else had happened, Robert Baratheon did not tremble. He said when he'd signed, "You'd better be a better king than I was." "I intend to be," Aegon said. "That's not hard." "No," Aegon said honestly, "it's not." Robert almost smiled. It was a strange and fleeting thing, that almost smile, a ghost of the man he'd been before everything, and then it was gone. He stood, and he was simply a very large, very tired man in expensive armor, and Aegon stepped aside to let him leave, and Robert Baratheon walked out of the throne room of the Red Keep for the last time without looking at the throne. The throne room was empty when Aegon walked in alone. He hadn't planned it as a solitary moment. It had simply worked out that way. The delegation was in the council chambers. Robb was managing the logistics of the handover. Miles was doing Miles things involving order and efficiency and the correction of deficiencies. And Serana had been intercepted by Varys, who had materialized from somewhere and apparently had a great deal to discuss. So he walked in alone, and the throne room was empty and enormous and cold, the high windows letting in the gray afternoon light, the dragon skulls along the walls watching from their alcoves, smaller as you went toward the back, larger toward the front, Balerion at the very end, the enormous skull of the Black Dread larger than a horse, larger than anything that should exist, grinning in the dim light with the patience of deep time. He walked the length of the room slowly. The Iron Throne was at the end of it. It was uglier than any description had prepared him for. Not ugly in the way of something made without craft, but ugly in the way of something made with too much. 1,000 swords, melted and fused and twisted, and hammered into a seat that looked less like furniture and more like the aftermath of a battle. Blades growing at every angle, the back rising 20 feet in a tangle of steel that caught the light on its edges. Every king who'd ever sat on it had apparently bled from it at some point. The metal of defeated enemies, made into the seat of the man who defeated them. It was the most honest object in Westeros, he thought, the realm's history visible in its construction, brutal and tangled and somehow still standing. He stood in front of it for a while. He was aware that this was a moment, that people would ask him later how it felt to stand in front of the Iron Throne, and he would need to have an answer. He tried to feel something definitive, triumph, completion, the satisfaction of a long purpose achieved. He felt versions of all of those things, but they were mixed with other things, more complicated, harder to name. He thought about Hallyne on the dock at Oros, holding the sealed letter in his shaking hands. He thought about the God's Wood at Winterfell and Ned Stark's face when he'd finally said the things he'd been holding for 17 years. He thought about Arya pressing her hand to Vhaegar's jaw in the cold morning light. He thought about Robert riding back to his camp, putting something down. He thought about Serana saying just quieter, asking what the morning after looked like. He reached out and touched one of the sword blades on the arm of the throne. The edge was sharp. He pulled his hand back before it cut him, not from fear, just because bleeding on the throne before he'd even sat on it seemed like the wrong kind of symbolism. Then he sat on it. The steel was cold and uncomfortable and dug into him in places that suggested whoever had made it had never actually intended it to be sat in for any length of time, which might have been the point. He looked down the length of the throne room from the elevated position, at the skull of Balerion at the far end, at the smaller skulls arranged by lineage and death date, at the high windows, at the empty hall. He was 18 years old and the rightful king, and he was sitting on the iron throne of the 7 kingdoms. He sat with it for about 30 seconds, alone, and let it be what it was. Then footsteps in the hall. Serana's footsteps, he knew them, had known them for years, could identify them in any building. She walked the length of the throne room without hurrying, her boots on the stone floor, and stopped at the foot of the dais and looked up at him with an expression that was more complicated than most of her expressions, which were already complicated. "Varies," she said, "is extraordinary. He told me 4 things in 12 minutes that changed my understanding of the political situation considerably." "What 4 things?" Later, she looked at him on the throne. "How is it?" "Cold," he said. "Uncomfortable, considerably uglier up close." "Good," she said. "The throne should be uncomfortable. A comfortable throne would be dangerous." "That's very wise." "I'm very wise," she said. He looked down at her from the throne's height, and she looked up at him, and the distance between them, the physical distance of the dais, the formal distance of the moment, was somehow both larger and smaller than it had ever been. Larger because the moment was real. The thing they'd spent years working toward had arrived, and they were standing inside it. Smaller because she was still Serana, still herself, still the person who called him Jon when it mattered, and he was still himself, and that didn't change just because the room was historic. He stood up from the throne, came down the dais steps, stopped in front of her. She was looking at him with the guard down, that particular rare honesty he'd only seen a handful of times, each one a gift. Her shoulder was healed. Her eyes were the silver gray of the sea on a clear morning, and they were very direct, and they were not pretending anything. "Jon," she said. "Yes," he said. "When I said that the morning after would be quieter," she said, "I was thinking about something specific." "Tell me." "I was thinking about not being at war." She held his gaze. "I was thinking about having a morning where there's no Raven to read and no fleet to organize and no Lannister column on the road and no—" She stopped. "No reason to put things off." He looked at her for a moment, then, "How long have you been putting things off?" "Years," she said. "You have too." "I have," he said. "We were waiting until it was done." "It's done," he said. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, and he covered it with his own, and the throne room of the Red Keep was very quiet around them, just the 2 of them and the cold light and the old skulls watching from the walls, and the world had reorganized itself into something that was going to require a great deal of work and was going to be, he thought, worth every part of it. The great hall of the Red Keep was full when Aegon walked in that evening. Not for a coronation, that was weeks away, a formal affair requiring septons and crowns and the attendance of lords from every corner of the realm, and he was not interested in rushing it. What filled the hall tonight was something more informal and more real. His people, gathered at long tables, the sounds of an army that had marched a long way and arrived somewhere and was now breathing out. The Northerners were at the far end, already loud, the Great Jon having apparently discovered the Red Keep's wine cellars and formed a strong opinion about them. The Second Sons were dispersed throughout, Durin's enormous frame visible above the crowd, his laugh audible across the room. Sir Miles was in a corner talking to Sir Barristan Selmy, and both of them had the careful, mutual respect of old soldiers comparing notes across what had been, until very recently, a significant political divide. Robb was sitting with a group of Riverland's lords, holding his wine cup and looking around the hall with the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they intended to arrive, and is taking a moment to acknowledge it. He caught Aegon's eye across the room and raised his cup. Aegon raised his back. Arya appeared at his elbow from nowhere, which was apparently her permanent means of arrival. "Sir Barristan wants to meet you properly," she said. "He's been trying to work out how to approach you all evening, and he won't just come over." "How do you know that?" "I asked him," she said, as if this were obvious. "You asked Sir Barristan why he wasn't approaching the king." "He seemed stuck," she said. "Someone had to." Aegon looked at her. She looked back at him with those ancient gray eyes that had no patience for social convention, and enormous patience for everything real. She had been in the 3 weeks of the march south, a constant presence, not formally, not officially, just persistently nearby in the way of someone who had decided that proximity to the center of things was where she intended to be, and had made this decision unilaterally and without consultation. "Tell him to come over," Aegon said. Arya nodded once and vanished back into the hall. Sir Barristan Selmy came across the room with the dignity of the greatest living knight, a man who had served 4 kings, who had fought at the Trident and the Stepstones and 100 smaller conflicts, who had known Aegon's father and grandfather and great-grandfather, and who was, by his own account, uncertain what to do with a Targaryen reclamation at his age. He stopped before Aegon and held himself very straight. "Your Grace," he said. "Sir Barristan," Aegon said. "I know you tried to counsel Robert toward negotiation." 3 times, Selmy said. "He declined." "I know. I'm telling you I know because it matters." He looked at the old knight directly. "I would be honored if you continued in service. Not out of continuity, not as a formality, because you are the finest knight in Westeros and your honor is not in question, and I want men around me whose honor is not in question." Selmy was quiet for a moment. The old face moved slightly, something adjusted behind the eyes. "You're very young," he said. "I am. Your father was young too, at his best." "Tell me about him sometime," Aegon said. "When you're ready. I want to know what he was actually like." Selmy looked at him for a long moment. "I'll serve," he said. "Your Grace." They shook hands, old knight and young king, and Aegon moved on through the hall. He found Hallyne near the fire at the hall's end, seated in a chair someone had found for him, a cup in his shaking hands, looking at the assembled company with an expression that had moved completely past words into something purely interior. He looked very old tonight, the old Maester, every year of it present, every year of the exile and the waiting and the long careful work of keeping a secret and a hope and a dragon egg alive across the narrow sea. Aegon pulled up a chair beside him. They sat together without speaking for a while, watching the hall, listening to the noise of it, the laughter and the argument and the general magnificent din of people who had done something significant and were now in the first hours of knowing that they'd done it. Then Hallyne said, very quietly, "She would have been insufferable about this." Aegon looked at him. "My mother, she would have found it so satisfying. She'd have sat here like this and just—" The old man made a gesture that somehow conveyed someone being quietly smug in the most endearing possible way. "She would have laughed about it, the whole thing. The ravens and the politics and the Lannisters and the look on Robert's face, she would have found it hilarious." He paused. "She always laughed at the wrong moments, which was also the right moments." Aegon sat with that. "I wish she'd seen it," he said. "She has," Hallyne said, with the absolute certainty of the very old who have stopped needing evidence for the things they know. "She's seen all of it." They sat there a while longer. Late that night, when the hall had thinned and the fires were lower, and the city outside was settling into its ordinary sounds, Aegon walked up to the high battlements of the Red Keep. The city spread below him in every direction, the lights of 500,000 lives, the smell of it, the sound of it, the enormous living fact of the largest city in Westeros. Vhagar landed on the battlement beside him. He was getting larger, Aegon thought, or maybe it was that the places they'd been recently were large enough to make him look appropriately sized. The dragon's head came around and pressed against his shoulder, that familiar weight and warmth, and Aegon put his arm over the broad neck and looked out at the city. The narrow sea was there, somewhere beyond the city's eastern edge, invisible in the dark but present. Essos was across it, Oros, the island, the cliffs, the place where he'd been a boy learning his name and his history, and the shape of everything he was going to do. He thought about Daenerys, out there somewhere, with her own dragons and her own army and her own fire. He'd had no response to the Raven yet. But she was coming, he was sure of it, had been sure since Duskendale, the certainty of someone who understood that two people pointed at the same truth from different directions would eventually find each other. When she arrived, there would be more negotiation, more complexity, another set of competing claims and combined strengths to navigate. He was ready for it. He was ready for all of it, the council chambers and the Lord's petitions, and the long, exhausting work of putting a broken realm back together piece by careful piece, the marriages and alliances and decades of patient governance that nobody ever wrote songs about because it happened too slowly and too quietly to make good music. The Iron Throne was cold and ugly, and it was his. The realm was fractured and beautiful and enormous, and it was his to tend. He was 18 years old, and he had never been afraid. Somewhere below, a city breathed in the dark, and somewhere above, the stars were the same stars that had watched the Targaryens cross the narrow sea 300 years ago with their 3 dragons and their impossible certainty. And the wheel of history had turned and come back around, and the blood of old Valyria was on the throne again where it belonged, not because of rage or conquest, not because of fire and terror, but because of patience and truth and the understanding that legitimacy was not given by victory but by rightness. He stayed there a long time. Vhagar made no sound, just breathed slowly, warm and old and alive. Aegon looked at his city, his kingdom, his inheritance, all the broken, beautiful, difficult thing of it, and he was not triumphant, not relieved, not even particularly proud. He was ready. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.